At 7 in the morning before going to work, my daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "Do not come home today." I did not think much of it at first, but when she slid a piece of paper across my custom marble kitchen island, a supposed new deed to my $2.5 million Atlanta estate, I understood exactly what she was trying to do. She gave me until 5 in the evening to pack up my entire life and vacate the premises. She thought she was evicting a helpless retired woman who had simply gotten lucky. She had absolutely no idea she had just declared war on the chief executive officer of a massive real estate empire. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled her entire life and her parents' lives by dinner time, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to put a toxic, entitled family member in their place. My name is Valerie. I am 58 years old, and for the past 30 years, I have built a life of quiet luxury from absolute scratch. The morning it all happened started like any other Tuesday. The house was perfectly still. I stood in my custom-built chef kitchen, savoring the rich aroma of my dark roast espresso. The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the lush buckhead tree line, pouring warm golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I built this house exactly the way I wanted it. Every slab of Calcutta marble, every piece of polished mahogany, and every inch of the sprawling gardens was a testament to my survival and my success. I loved the quiet mornings before the house woke up. But that peace was abruptly shattered by the sound of expensive slippers slapping against the hardwood floor. It was Chloe, my 28-year-old daughter-in-law. She was a woman who walked into rooms like she had already bought them. She married my son Marcus 2 years ago, and ever since she crossed the threshold of my home, she had been nothing but a parasite wrapped in designer clothing. Marcus. My 32-year-old son was a brilliant surgeon, but an absolute fool when it came to love. He was the golden child I had sacrificed everything for, but he was entirely blind to the venomous snake sleeping in his bed. Chloe breezed into the kitchen holding a glass of green juice, but it was not her arrogant posture that made my blood run cold. It was what she was wearing. Wrapped around her pale shoulders was my vintage emerald green silk robe. I bought that robe in Paris 10 years ago after closing my first multi-million-dollar commercial property deal. It was a deeply personal item kept hidden in the back of my master suite closet. Seeing her wearing it, dragging the delicate silk hem across the kitchen floor, felt like a physical violation. "Good morning, Valerie," she chirped with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She did not call me Mom or even Mother. It was always Valerie delivered with a slight condescending edge. I took a slow sip of my espresso, ignoring the disrespect. "You are up early, Chloe, and you are in my closet." She rolled her eyes, letting out a breath of dramatic exhaustion. "Oh, please do not start with the possessive attitude today. We have much bigger things to discuss. Actually, I have something to tell you." She walked over to the kitchen island and casually tossed a thick manila folder onto the marble surface. It slid across the smooth stone and stopped right next to my coffee cup. "Do not come home today, Valerie," she said, her voice dropping its fake sweetness. "Actually, do not come back at all." I looked at the folder, then back up at her perfectly manicured face. I did not blink. I did not gasp. When you spend 30 years swimming with corporate sharks, you learn never to bleed on the first bite. "What exactly is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "That is your eviction notice," she said, leaning against the counter and crossing her arms. "Marcus and I had a long talk last night. We are starting our own family soon, and we need the space. This house is far too big for a single elderly woman. So Marcus and I legally transferred the deed of this estate into my name. It is done, Valerie. The house belongs to me now. You have until 5 this evening to have movers come and pick up whatever clothes and trinkets you want to keep. Anything left behind will be sold or thrown out." I carefully set my espresso cup down. The ceramic clinked softly against the saucer. I opened the folder. Inside was a stack of legal documents that looked remarkably official. There were stamped signatures and a completely fabricated transfer of property. I read through the first page, scanning the legal jargon. I noticed immediately what she had done. She had used Marcus and his medical power of attorney, a document meant for emergency healthcare decisions, to attempt a fraudulent transfer of assets. And right there at the bottom of the second page was my signature. Forged. And poorly forged at that. Chloe let out a short, mocking laugh as she watched me read. Look, Valerie, I know this is hard for you, but let us be honest. You do not belong in a neighborhood like this anyway. It is time for you to go back to the projects where you belong. You can take your little retirement savings and go find a nice quiet apartment on the south side. My parents are moving in this weekend to help us prepare for the baby. We are hosting a massive housewarming and estate sale at 4 o'clock today to clear out all this outdated junk. So I really need you gone before my guests arrive. The projects. The absolute audacity of this little girl standing in my house drinking juice from my refrigerator, wearing my silk robe, and telling me to go back to the projects. She thought I was just a retired school administrator. That was the cover story I gave Marcus to tell her when they first started dating. I never wanted my son to be targeted for his wealth, so I hid the true extent of my financial empire. Sterling Holdings, my corporate trust, owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Atlanta. But Chloe thought I was just an old black woman who had scraped together enough pennies to buy a nice house. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the pure, unadulterated entitlement, the racial arrogance, the sheer greed. But what broke my heart for a fraction of a second was the realization that my son, my beautiful, brilliant Marcus, had allowed this to happen. He was too cowardly to face me himself. He had let his wife walk downstairs and attempt to throw his own mother out onto the street. I closed the folder. I smoothed my hand over the cover. I did not scream. I did not throw my hot coffee in her face. I knew that if I raised my voice, she would instantly play the victim. She would cry. She would call Marcus. She might even call the police and claim the angry black woman was threatening her. I was not going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I gave her a warm, terrifying smile. "Is that right?" I said softly. "Yes," she replied, her chin jutting out slightly, trying to maintain her bravado. 5 o'clock, Valerie. Do not make me call the authorities and have you forcefully removed. It would be highly embarrassing for you. I nodded slowly. I picked up my leather briefcase from the chair next to me. I packed my laptop. I placed my empty espresso cup perfectly in the center of the sink. I walked past her, smelling my own expensive French perfume radiating off my stolen silk robe. "I will be out of your way, Chloe," I said without looking back. "Have a wonderful housewarming party." I walked out the front door and stepped into the cool morning air. The gravel crunched under my designer heels as I made my way to my black Porsche Panamera. I unlocked the car, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door. The heavy thud of the car door shutting sealed me in complete silence. I sat there for a moment, gripping the leather steering wheel. She wanted to play a legal game with properties. She wanted to forge documents and steal my home. She wanted to move her bankrupt racist parents into the sanctuary I built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. She gave me until 5 o'clock. I reached for my phone and dialed the private number of my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. "Good morning, Miss Valerie," he said. "Good morning, Jonathan," I replied, my voice cold as ice. "Freeze every single financial account connected to Marcus. Cut off all his credit cards. Then I need you to do a deep dive into Richard and Susan Kensington. That is Chloe and her parents. Buy up every single piece of debt their failing business owes by noon today. And Jonathan." "Yes, Miss Valerie. Get the corporate fraud division of the police department on standby for this afternoon. We have a felony forgery case taking place at my residence." I ended the call and started the engine. The Porsche roared to life. Chloe thought she had won, but she had no idea that she had just handed me the shovel she would use to dig her own grave. The clock was ticking, and by the time the sun went down, she would be leaving my property in handcuffs. At 7 in the morning, my daughter-in-law told me to never come back to my own home. By 8:30, I was standing in the penthouse office of a downtown Atlanta skyscraper, preparing to dismantle her entire existence. The drive from my estate in Buckhead to the financial district took exactly 22 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I let the low hum of my car engine fill the silence as I planned my exact next steps. Chloe thought I was driving to some cheap motel on the outskirts of the city to cry and pack my bags. She believed her own lies so completely that she never once bothered to look into who I actually was. For 2 years, I let my daughter-in-law believe I was a retired middle school administrator living off a modest pension. I let her make her passive-aggressive comments at family dinners. I did all of this to protect my son Marcus from the reality of our immense wealth. But today, the masquerade was officially over. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of the Sterling Building, a towering glass and steel structure. I parked in the spot marked strictly for the chief executive officer. When I stepped onto the private elevator, the doors closed silently, isolating me from the outside world. The elevator shot up to the penthouse floor. The polished doors slid open to reveal the sprawling, immaculate offices of Sterling Corporate Holdings, my company, my empire. I walked directly down the marble hallway toward my corner office. My lead corporate attorney, Jonathan, was already sitting at my mahogany conference table with a team of junior lawyers. They looked serious. They knew I did not call emergency meetings at 8 in the morning unless something drastic had occurred. I set my leather briefcase on the table and pulled out the manila folder Chloe had thrown at me earlier. I slid it across the polished wood toward Jonathan. I told him my daughter-in-law had just given me an eviction notice and claimed she owned my house. I told him she gave me until 5 o'clock this evening to vacate my own property. Jonathan did not laugh. He opened the folder and began reading the documents. The junior lawyers leaned in, scanning the pages. Within a few minutes, Jonathan looked up at me and took off his glasses. The room went completely silent. He told me the entire document was a complete fabrication, but it was worse than just a simple fake deed. Jonathan explained exactly how Chloe had managed to get the paperwork processed. She had used a medical power of attorney document to force the transfer. A medical power of attorney is only meant to give someone the legal right to make healthcare decisions in severe emergencies. Marcus had signed one for Chloe last year because as a busy trauma surgeon, he was often in the operating room for 12 hours straight and could not be reached. Chloe had somehow taken that healthcare document, attached it to a quitclaim deed, and presented it to a naive or corrupt clerk as a general financial power of attorney. And then she had blatantly forged my signature at the very bottom. She actually believed she could steal a multi-million-dollar estate with a stolen medical form and a cheap pen. I felt a cold wave of anger wash over me, not just at Chloe, but at Marcus. My son was a brilliant surgeon who saved lives every single day, but he was entirely blind to the viper sleeping in his house. I asked Jonathan what the legal ramifications were for her actions. He told me it was a clear case of felony forgery and attempted grand larceny. He said we could have her arrested immediately. But I shook my head. I told him no. I did not want her arrested quietly in the morning. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her arrogance in front of an audience. Then one of the junior lawyers slid her tablet across the table to me. She looked hesitant, but said I needed to see what Chloe was posting online. I looked at the screen. It was the social media page belonging to Chloe. She had posted a public invitation just an hour ago. The bright digital flyer read, "Estate sale and grand housewarming party today at 4 o'clock in the afternoon." The caption below it made my blood boil. Chloe wrote that she and Marcus were finally clearing out his mother and her old, outdated junk to make room for their new modern life and their future baby. She invited her entire country club social circle, but what caught my eye was the guest of honor section. She had explicitly listed her parents Richard and Susan Kensington as the new permanent residents of the guest wing. They were planning to sell my generational heirlooms. I scrolled through the pictures she had attached to the invitation. She had placed neon price tags on my personal belongings. My grandmother and her antique silver tea set, which survived the Great Depression, was marked for $50. A custom mahogany dining table was listed for $200. But the absolute worst was a painting hanging in my hallway. It was an original piece by a renowned African-American artist depicting the civil rights movement. It was worth at least $200,000 and held immense cultural and personal significance to my family. Chloe had slapped a sticker on it that said, "Old Wall Art $5. She was going to let her wealthy, racist parents walk into my house and sleep in my guest wing while selling my family history for pennies to her ignorant friends. The sheer audacity of her plan was breathtaking. She wanted to erase my existence completely and replace it with her own. I handed the tablet back to the junior lawyer. I stood up and walked over to the tall window looking out over the Atlanta skyline. I took a deep breath. I turned back to my legal team and gave them my final orders for the morning. I told Jonathan to pull up the Sterling Family Trust. Marcus was a direct beneficiary of that trust. Every single dollar he earned at the hospital was funneled into his accounts through our private wealth management system to protect him from lawsuits. I told Jonathan to freeze it all. I wanted his checking account frozen. I wanted his savings account frozen. I wanted the luxury credit card he gave to Chloe completely shut down. I told Jonathan to sever the financial umbilical cord immediately. I wanted my son to swipe his card for lunch today and have it decline. He needed to understand the consequences of handing over his power to a woman who did not respect his mother. Jonathan nodded and began typing furiously on his laptop. Within a very short time, the transfer was complete. Marcus and Chloe were completely cut off from the Sterling fortune. They did not have a single penny to their names. But freezing the accounts was just the first phase of my retaliation. Chloe thought she was rich because she married my son. Her parents, Richard and Susan, thought they were better than me because they came from old money. But I knew the truth about the Kensington family. I had known since the day of the wedding rehearsal. Richard Kensington owned a regional shipping company that had been quietly bleeding money for the past 5 years. He was drowning in commercial debt. He had borrowed millions just to keep up appearances and maintain his membership at the golf course. He and Susan were secretly bankrupt. That was the real reason Chloe had targeted Marcus. She needed a financial bailout for herself and a free mansion for her parents. I looked at my financial director who had just walked into the room. I told him to find every single commercial loan Richard Kensington owed. I wanted to know who held the paper on his company and his personal estate. The director pulled up the financial records on the main screen. Richard owed over $4 million to an investment bank in Chicago. I did not even blink. I told my director to call the bank immediately. I ordered him to buy the entire debt portfolio belonging to Richard Kensington. I offered to purchase the commercial notes at a premium if the bank transferred ownership to Sterling Holdings within the hour. The director picked up the phone and stepped out of the room to make the call. I sat back down at the table and poured myself a glass of water. I felt a calm, absolute certainty settling over me. By noon today, I would not just be the woman Chloe was trying to evict. I would be the sole creditor of her father and his entire existence. I would own his business. I would own his house. I would hold the absolute power to liquidate his life with a single phone call. Chloe had scheduled her little housewarming party and estate sale for 4:00 this afternoon. She had invited her friends to sip champagne and laugh at my belongings. She had invited her parents to move into my home and claim it as their own. She thought I was miles away packing my bags in defeat. I told my legal team to cancel all my afternoon meetings. I told Jonathan to have the corporate fraud detectives on standby just like I asked him earlier. I was going to let Chloe set up her party. I was going to let her pop the expensive champagne and greet her guests. I was going to let her feel like the queen of the castle for a few short hours. And then I was going to walk through my own front door and burn her entire world to the ground. I left my downtown corporate office at exactly 3:00 in the afternoon. The Atlanta traffic was surprisingly light for a Tuesday, allowing me plenty of time to mentally prepare for the absolute spectacle waiting at my home. I drove my Porsche with the windows slightly down, letting the warm southern breeze wash over me. I was not angry anymore. The initial shock of the morning had completely evaporated and had been replaced by a cold, calculated focus. I had spent the last several hours dismantling the financial foundation of the Kensington family. Now it was time to address the physical invasion of my property. Chloe had told me to be completely moved out by 5:00. She wanted me gone before her high society friends arrived, but I decided to change the schedule. I pulled onto my street at exactly 3:45. As I approached the tall iron gates of my estate, I saw that they had been propped wide open. A young man in a cheap uniform was acting as a valet parking cars on my pristine front lawn. The entire circular driveway was jammed with luxury vehicles. There were brand new European sports cars and massive black sport utility vehicles crushing the rare hydrangeas I had imported from France. Chloe had invited her entire country club social circle. These were the kind of people who spent their days sipping mimosas and complaining about the hired help. They had absolutely no idea they were trespassing on the private property of a corporate chief executive officer. I parked my Porsche at the very end of the street, refusing to hand my keys to the unauthorized valet. I wanted to walk up my own driveway and take in every single detail of this ridiculous charade. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the white brick of my massive home. I walked slowly, letting the gravel crunch beneath my designer shoes. I could hear the faint sound of a string quartet playing classical music in the backyard. Chloe had really gone all out to impress her friends. She was spending money she did not actually have on a lifestyle she completely stole. As I approached the grand double front doors, I saw her standing on the front portico. She was wearing a stunning white cocktail dress that looked suspiciously like a piece from my own summer wardrobe. She was holding a crystal champagne flute and laughing loudly with a group of women draped in expensive jewelry. I stopped at the bottom of the marble steps and just watched her for a moment. She was introducing the estate to her friends. I could hear her high-pitched voice carrying over the gentle breeze. She was telling them that this was her newly purchased ancestral home. She claimed that she and Marcus had finally bought the property to start their own family legacy. She actually used the word ancestral, as if her family had any history of building wealth instead of just squandering it. She pointed to the custom mahogany front doors and told her friends she was planning to paint them a modern gray color. Every word out of her mouth was a complete fabrication. She was standing on the steps of a house I built from nothing, playing the role of a wealthy heiress. I began walking up the marble steps. My footsteps were quiet but purposeful. I did not storm up to her. I simply glided into the crowd of wealthy women. None of them noticed me at first. They were too busy admiring the intricate masonry of my front porch. But then, the front door swung open and Susan Kensington stepped out. Susan was the mother of my daughter-in-law. She was a woman who always wore too much perfume and smiled with her teeth tightly clenched. Susan was carrying a large silver tray covered in filled champagne flutes. She looked flustered and entirely out of her element, trying to play the gracious hostess in a house she did not own. Susan walked right toward me. She did not look at my face. She only saw a black woman standing near the entrance. In her racially biased mind, a black woman standing quietly at a wealthy gathering could only be one thing. She shoved the heavy silver tray directly toward my chest. She told me to take the tray and start serving the guests on the south patio. She said the catering staff was being horribly slow, and she needed me to pick up the pace before the hot appetizers got cold. I stood perfectly still. I looked at the tray, and then I looked up directly into her pale blue eyes. It took Susan a few seconds to actually focus on my face. When she finally recognized me, all the color drained from her cheeks. Her mouth fell open in a small, silent circle of shock. But Susan was a master of fake Southern hospitality. She quickly recovered and put on a bright artificial smile. She let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across a sidewalk. She said, "Oh, Valerie, I am so incredibly sorry. I thought you were part of the catering staff. Chloe told me you had already packed your things and moved into an assisted living facility this morning. She deliberately insulted me twice in a single breath. First, she pretended to mistake the owner of a multi-million-dollar estate for a hired server. Then she casually mentioned a fake story about me being sent to a nursing home. It was a classic Kensington family tactic. They delivered their venom wrapped in a sweet, polite package. The women standing around Chloe suddenly stopped talking and turned to look at me. The air grew incredibly tense. Chloe spun around, her eyes widening in absolute panic when she saw me standing there. She checked her diamond watch. It was only 4:00. I was an hour early and I had ruined her grand entrance. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but I did not give her the chance. I smiled warmly at Susan, a genuine calm smile that completely unnerved her. I reached out and delicately picked up a single crystal flute of champagne from her heavy tray. I took a slow sip, savoring the expensive vintage. I told Susan that there was absolutely no need to apologize. I said I simply came back to mingle and see how the new owners were settling into the neighborhood. I kept my voice perfectly even and pleasant. I did not raise my tone. I did not cause a scene. I played their little game perfectly. Susan looked confused. Chloe looked completely terrified. She did not know what to do. She had expected me to yell or cry or beg for my house back. She was prepared for an angry confrontation. She was completely unprepared for me to politely drink her champagne and walk right past her into the grand foyer. I stepped through the front doors and entered my own home as a guest. The inside of the house was swarming with people. They were wandering through the rooms, touching my things and drinking my wine. I walked into the formal living room and felt a sharp twist in my chest. The room had been completely rearranged. My expensive velvet sofas had been pushed against the walls to create a walking path. Spread across the tables and display cases were hundreds of my personal items. This was the estate sale Chloe had bragged about online. She was literally selling my life to her friends. I walked over to the grand piano. Sitting on top of it was a beautiful antique clock that my grandfather had given me when I graduated from college. It was an irreplaceable piece of family history. Attached to the top of the clock was a bright pink neon sticker. The sticker said, $20. I felt my heartbeat steady in my chest. I picked up the clock and looked at the sticker. $20 for a piece of my soul. I set the clock back down and moved to the next table. Chloe had laid out my entire collection of first edition classic novels. These books were worth thousands of dollars. She had priced them at $2 each. I watched as a wealthy woman in a pink suit picked up my rare copy of a famous novel, shoved it into her designer purse, and handed a $5 bill to a young girl acting as a cashier. They were treating my life like a cheap garage sale. I continued walking through the house holding my champagne flute. I walked into the formal dining room and saw more of my things completely disrespected. My silver cutlery was dumped into plastic bins. My crystal vases were gathered on a folding table. Every single item had a ridiculous price tag attached to it. Chloe was essentially giving away my wealth to people who were already rich. I mingled with the guests. I listened to them gossip about the strange old woman who used to live here. I listened to them praise Chloe for bringing such fresh, modern energy to the neighborhood. I did not say a word to correct them. I just smiled and nodded, sipping my drink. I saw Marcus, my own son, standing in the corner of the room. He was wearing a tailored suit and talking to a group of doctors from his hospital. He looked extremely uncomfortable. He kept glancing toward the front door as if he was waiting for the police to arrive. He did not know that his accounts were already frozen. He did not know that the luxury life he thought he was living had already been dismantled. I caught his eye from across the room. He froze completely. All the color washed out of his face. I simply raised my champagne glass to him in a silent toast and turned away. I walked out onto the back patio where the string quartet was playing. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawn. The party was in full swing. Laughter and music filled the air. Chloe thought she had completely erased me. She thought she had won the ultimate victory. She had no idea that I was standing in the middle of her fake kingdom, holding the match that was going to burn it all down. I found a quiet spot near the rose garden and stood perfectly still, observing the crowd. I watched Susan boasting to her friends about her new guest room. I watched Chloe acting like the lady of the manor. I watched them all dancing on the edge of a cliff they did not even know existed. I checked my watch. It was almost 4:30. I had allowed them to enjoy their little fantasy for 30 minutes. It was almost time for the real show to begin. I finished my champagne and placed the empty crystal flute on a passing waiter's tray. I smoothed the invisible wrinkles from my tailored suit. I took a deep breath of the fragrant garden air. I had built this empire with nothing but my own intelligence and relentless determination. No entitled child was going to steal it from me with a forged signature. The ambush had been set. The trap was fully loaded. Now it was time to let the jaws snap shut. I stood near the rose garden watching the ridiculous spectacle unfold on my back lawn. The string quartet played a lively symphony while strangers drank my expensive wine and laughed. I was perfectly composed, waiting for the right moment to strike. But then I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. I turned and saw my son, Marcus. He was sweating slightly, and his eyes darted around the yard, making sure none of his wealthy friends were watching us. He grabbed my arm with a firm grip and told me we needed to talk in private right now. I did not resist. I let him guide me through the French doors and down the long hallway, away from the noise of the party. He led me straight into my own private study. The study was a room I designed specifically for quiet reflection. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling cherrywood bookshelves filled with leather-bound novels and legal texts. In the center of the room sat a massive oak desk. Marcus closed the heavy door behind us, shutting out the music and the laughter. He ran a hand over his face, looking incredibly stressed. I stood in the center of the room and simply watched him. I waited for him to apologize. I waited for him to tell me he had no idea what his wife was doing. I waited for the brilliant little boy I raised to show a single ounce of integrity. But that did not happen. Marcus leaned against my oak desk and let out a long breath. He looked at me with a mixture of guilt and annoyance. He said, "Mom, you should not be here right now. Chloe has been stressed all day preparing for this party, and seeing you here is just going to upset her." I stared at him, taking in his perfectly tailored suit and his expensive watch, a watch I bought for him when he graduated from medical school. I asked him in a calm, flat voice if he knew his wife had handed me an eviction notice at 7 o'clock this morning. Marcus shifted uncomfortably and looked down at the expensive Persian rug. He said, "Mom, please try to understand our position. Chloe is pregnant. We just found out a few weeks ago, and she has been incredibly anxious about the future. We are going to have a baby, and we need the space. You are single, and you are retired. You do not need a massive estate with 7 bedrooms and a guest wing. Chloe and I need this house to build our family. Her parents are moving in this weekend because Susan is going to help Chloe with the baby. It just makes sense for you to downsize." I listened to his words and felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest. He was standing in my house telling me that my daughter-in-law and her racist parents were entitled to the empire I built. He was using a supposed pregnancy as an excuse to throw his own mother out onto the street. I kept my face completely blank. I did not let him see the pain his words caused me. I asked him if he also knew Chloe used his medical power of attorney to forge my signature on a fake property deed. I wanted to see exactly how far his betrayal went. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he had since he was a little boy. He said he was simply too busy at the hospital to deal with real estate paperwork. He told me he worked 80 hours a week saving lives, and he trusted his wife to handle their domestic affairs. He admitted he gave Chloe the medical document because she told him it was just a formality needed by the county clerk to transfer the utility bills. He said he did not know the exact details of how she got the deed transferred, but he supported her decision entirely. He actually stood there and defended a felony. My brilliant son, the chief trauma surgeon, was acting like a naive fool. He chose to blindly follow a manipulative woman instead of questioning why she would need a medical emergency form to handle real estate documents. He was so desperate to please Chloe and her wealthy parents that he completely abandoned his own common sense. Then the gaslighting began. Marcus stood up straighter, trying to assert dominance in a room that belonged to me. He lowered his voice and told me that I was being incredibly selfish. He said I had lived a good life, but it was time for me to step aside and let him lead his family. He told me that Chloe came from a very prominent family and she was used to a certain standard of living. He said he could not afford to buy a house like this on his hospital salary alone, and he felt humiliated that his mother was hoarding wealth while he struggled to provide a suitable environment for his pregnant wife. I listened to him paint me as the villain. He twisted the narrative so completely that he genuinely believed he was the victim. He told me I needed to respect his new family and accept that things were changing. He said if I loved him, I would pack my bags quietly and go find a nice condo somewhere far away from their social circle. He actually told me that I was embarrassing him by mingling with the guests and making Chloe uncomfortable in her own home. Every word that came out of his mouth was a betrayal. I had spent my entire life shielding him from the harsh realities of the world. I paid for his undergraduate degree. I paid for his medical school. I funded the trust that subsidized his luxurious lifestyle. And this was my reward. I realized in that exact moment that the boy I raised was gone. Marcus was no longer my son. He was a weak man who had allowed himself to be consumed by the Kensington family. He had traded his heritage and his dignity for the illusion of high society acceptance. I did not scream at him. I did not cry. I simply nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch between us. The air in the study felt heavy and suffocating. Marcus seemed relieved by my silence. He mistakenly thought my quiet demeanor meant I was surrendering. He offered me a small, patronizing smile. He told me he was glad we could have this talk, and he hoped we could still see each other on holidays once the baby was born. He said he would even give me a few $1,000s to help cover my moving expenses as a gesture of goodwill. The sheer arrogance of his offer was staggering. He was offering me pennies from a bank account that I completely owned and controlled, an account that was currently frozen solid. I just looked at him and said nothing. I wanted him to remember this conversation. I wanted him to remember exactly what he said and how he acted when the reality of his situation finally crashed down upon him. Marcus checked his expensive watch again and said he needed to get back to the party before his father-in-law noticed he was missing. He turned his back on me and reached for the brass handle of the study door. As he pulled the heavy door open, I saw something moving in the shadows of the adjacent hallway. My study connected to a private library through a short corridor. The door to the library had been left slightly ajar. I looked past my son's shoulder and peered into the dimly lit room. The party outside was loud enough to cover any small noises inside the house. I saw the distinct silhouette of a man kneeling on the floor behind my reading chair. It was Richard Kensington. Chloe and her father had separated themselves from the rest of the guests. While Susan and Chloe were playing hostesses outside, Richard was inside conducting a very specific search. I watched through the narrow opening as Richard pulled back the edge of the large Persian rug. He was kneeling directly over the brass dial of my hidden floor safe, the safe where I kept my most sensitive corporate documents. Richard was not just a bankrupt businessman looking for a free place to live. He was an active thief trying to crack open my secure vault while drinking my liquor. The ultimate betrayal from my son had just been overshadowed by a blatant criminal act. I let Marcus walk out of the room completely unaware of his father-in-law's actions. I stayed behind in the quiet study, my eyes locked on the kneeling figure in the dark. The time for any polite observation was now completely and permanently over. I waited until the heavy oak door of my study clicked completely shut behind my son Marcus. The room was perfectly silent again, but my attention was entirely focused on the narrow corridor leading into the private library. I moved quietly, stepping off the plush Persian rug and onto the polished hardwood floor. I did not want my heels to make a single sound. I walked slowly through the dimly lit passageway. The library was my sanctuary, filled with rare first editions and comfortable leather reading chairs. But right now, there was an intruder defiling my sacred space. I stopped just inside the doorway and watched. Richard Kensington was kneeling on the floor, his expensive suit pants gathering dust from the hardwood. He had rolled back the heavy wool rug, exposing the circular brass dial of my hidden floor safe. He was using a small silver stethoscope, pressing it against the cold metal and slowly turning the dial. He was completely absorbed in his criminal act. He was sweating, his face flushed with greedy determination. I stood there for a full minute, simply observing the sheer desperation of a bankrupt man trying to steal from the woman he secretly despised. Richard turned the dial again and let out a frustrated sigh when the heavy locking mechanism did not click. I took a step forward into the room and let the heel of my shoe strike the floor with a loud, sharp crack. Richard jumped violently. The stethoscope slipped from his hands and clattered loudly against the brass safe. He spun around, still on his knees, and stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. For a brief second, he looked exactly like a rat caught in a trap. He scrambled to his feet, brushing the dust off his trousers, trying desperately to regain his composure. He opened his mouth to speak, but he could not find the words. The suave, arrogant father of the bride was completely speechless. I looked down at the exposed safe and then back up at his red, sweating face. I asked him very calmly if he had lost something. The fear in his eyes slowly morphed into something else. It morphed into a deep, ugly rage. He realized he was caught red-handed, but instead of showing remorse or apologizing, he decided to attack. He kicked the stethoscope away and puffed out his chest, trying to physically intimidate me. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He told me I had no right to sneak up on him in his daughter's house. He took a step toward me, his face contorting into a sneer of pure contempt. He dropped the polite Southern gentleman facade completely. He looked at me with an expression of disgust and delivered a line that I will never forget. He said, "You people never know how to manage wealth anyway." He said, "You just get lucky and hoard it while the rest of us actually work for a living." He told me that Chloe deserved this house and everything inside it because she knew how to properly maintain a legacy. You people. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with generations of racial arrogance. He was standing in a mansion I built with my own hands trying to rob my personal safe, and he still believed he was inherently superior to me. He believed that because of the color of my skin and his perceived social status, he was entitled to my fortune. He told me that his shipping company was just going through a temporary rough patch and that taking a few things from my safe was just a small loan to keep his business afloat. He actually tried to justify his attempted burglary as a necessary business transaction. I listened to his pathetic rationalizations, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold pity. I knew something he did not know. I knew that I had already purchased every single commercial loan attached to his failing business. I was already his sole creditor. I owned his company, his house, and his entire financial future. But I did not tell him that yet. I just stared at him with an icy calm that seemed to unnerve him even more than anger would have. Before Richard could say another word, the library door swung open wide. Chloe marched into the room holding a clipboard and looking incredibly annoyed. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing there with her father. She looked at the rolled-back rug and the exposed floor safe. She knew exactly what her father had been doing, but she did not care. Instead, her eyes locked onto me, and her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She demanded to know what I was still doing in the house. She reminded me that she had given me until 5 o'clock to pack my things and leave. She stepped directly between me and her father, shielding him as if I were the one attacking them. She raised her voice so loud that the sound echoed off the high ceilings. She told me I was trespassing on her private property and that she was not going to tolerate my presence for another second. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I simply told her that she was wearing my silk robe this morning and now her father was trying to crack my floor safe. I told her they were nothing but a family of thieves dressed in expensive clothes. That was the exact moment Chloe decided to escalate the situation to a dangerous new level. She pulled her smartphone out of her pocket and her eyes went completely dark. She told me I had made a massive mistake. She dialed 911 and pressed the phone to her ear. Instantly, her entire demeanor changed. The angry, aggressive woman vanished completely. In her place was a terrified, fragile, pregnant victim. She began crying hysterically into the phone. She told the emergency dispatcher that there was an aggressive intruder in her home. She gave them my exact address. She sobbed, clutching her stomach and claiming that her estranged mother-in-law had broken into the house and was threatening her and her unborn baby. She begged the police to hurry, saying she was terrified for her life and that I was refusing to leave. She put on an absolute masterclass in manipulation. She used her tears and her supposed pregnancy as a weapon to destroy me. She knew exactly how the police would react to a crying wealthy white woman claiming to be threatened by an angry black woman. She was trying to get me arrested or worse. She wanted me dragged out of my own home in handcuffs in front of all her high society friends. Richard stood behind her, nodding in agreement, acting like the protective father guarding his distressed daughter. I stood perfectly still watching her performance. I did not try to stop her from making the call. I did not try to grab the phone. I just let her dig the hole deeper and deeper. While she cried fake tears to the dispatcher, a memory flashed through my mind. It was a memory from exactly 2 weeks before Marcus and Chloe got married. I had received a panicked phone call from Chloe late at night. She had been crying real tears back then. She had secretly accumulated $80,000 in credit card debt by buying designer clothes, luxury vacations, and expensive jewelry to impress Marcus. She had hidden the debt from him entirely. The credit card companies were threatening to sue her and garnish her wages. She knew that if Marcus found out about the massive debt before the wedding, he would call the whole thing off. Marcus despised financial irresponsibility, so she came crying to me, begging me to save her. She played the naive young girl who simply made a few mistakes trying to fit into our wealthy world. Against my better judgment, I paid off the entire $80,000 balance. I wiped her slate clean. I did it because I wanted my son to be happy, and I did not want him starting his marriage tied to her hidden financial ruin. I made her promise never to lie to him again. She hugged me and called me her savior. Looking at her now sobbing into the phone and trying to have me arrested for standing in my own library, I realized exactly what she was. She was not a naive girl who made mistakes. She was a calculated, ruthless parasite. She had been a parasite from day one, draining my resources and manipulating my son. She saw my wealth as her personal bank account and my kindness as a weakness to be exploited. I had paid off her debts. I had welcomed her into my home. And her gratitude was an eviction notice and a fake call to the police. Chloe hung up the phone and wiped her dry eyes. She dropped the terrified victim act immediately and smirked at me. She told me the police were on their way and that I was going to be publicly humiliated. She said I was going to spend the night in a jail cell and that she was going to file a permanent restraining order against me first thing in the morning. Richard crossed his arms and told me I should have just left quietly when I had the chance. They both stood there radiating arrogance, completely confident that they had won the war. I looked at the exposed brass dial of my safe. I looked at the stethoscope lying on the floor. Then I looked at Chloe and her father. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. I felt a deep, profound sense of absolute power. I told Chloe that calling the police was the smartest thing she had done all day. I told her I was very much looking forward to speaking with the officers when they arrived. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit and walked past them, heading straight for the grand foyer to wait for the authorities. I was not going to run. I was going to stand in the center of my castle and watch the police uncover the massive fraud she had committed. The trap was now fully armed, and Chloe had just personally invited the authorities to witness her own spectacular downfall. I walked out of the library and made my way toward the grand foyer. The marble floors echoed slightly beneath my shoes. I could hear the string quartet still playing outside on the patio. The guests were oblivious to the criminal act that had just occurred inside. I stood near the mahogany front doors and folded my hands quietly in front of me. I was not going to hide. I was not going to run away. I waited patiently for the inevitable sound of the loud police sirens. It did not take long for the authorities to arrive. 10 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the front windows. 2 police cruisers pulled aggressively into my driveway, ignoring the valet. The tires crunched loudly over the gravel, causing several guests to stop talking and stare. The heavy doors of the cruisers swung open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. They looked serious and prepared for an altercation. Chloe had told the dispatcher an aggressive intruder was threatening her life. The officers walked briskly up the front steps. I reached out and pulled the front doors wide open before they could ring the bell. I stood in the doorway perfectly calm. The officers stopped for a fraction of a second, confused. They expected a chaotic scene with a frantic pregnant woman and a dangerous criminal. Instead, they found me standing quietly in my tailored suit. Before the officers could speak, Chloe came rushing from the back hallway. She pushed past me forcefully, running directly toward the police officers. She threw herself toward the taller officer, acting as if she would collapse. She put on an absolute masterclass of a performance. Her face was pale, and tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, sobbing uncontrollably. She told the officers I was the intruder she called about. She claimed I had broken into her home and refused to leave. She clutched her stomach tightly, emphasizing her supposed pregnancy. She begged the officers to put me in handcuffs immediately. She said she was terrified I was going to hurt her. She played the fragile victim flawlessly. Richard came jogging out behind her, playing the protective father. He stood next to his daughter and glared at me with hatred. He told the officers I was a disgruntled former resident harassing his pregnant daughter. He demanded they arrest me for trespassing. The younger officer took out his notepad and began writing everything down. He looked at me with a stern expression and asked me to step away from the homeowners. I did not argue. I took 3 slow steps back, giving them space. I wanted the officers to document every lie. The older officer stepped forward. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a silver name tag reading Captain Davis. When I saw his name and looked closely at his face, a small, quiet smile touched my mouth. I recognized him immediately. 20 years ago, before building my massive corporate empire, I started a charity foundation. It was dedicated to helping underprivileged youth in Atlanta pay for higher education. Marcus was just a little boy back then. One of the first recipients of my scholarship was a brilliant young man studying criminal justice. That young man was Captain Davis. My foundation paid for his entire college tuition. I attended his graduation ceremony and shook his hand. He promised me that day he would dedicate his life to protecting the community with integrity. Now here he was standing in my foyer 20 years later wearing a captain's badge. He looked at me, and our eyes locked. I saw the immediate flash of recognition in his eyes. He knew exactly who I was. He knew I was Valerie Sterling, the philanthropist who changed his life. He knew I was a woman of character. Captain Davis did not reveal our connection. He was a professional and knew how to read a room. He saw my calm demeanor and the absolute hysteria coming from Chloe. He subtly nodded his head at me, a tiny gesture only I could see. It was a silent promise that he would handle the situation carefully. He turned his attention back to Chloe, who was still crying and demanding I be taken away in chains. Captain Davis spoke in a deep, calming voice. He asked Chloe to lower her voice and provide proof she owned the property. Chloe eagerly nodded and wiped her fake tears. She reached into the manila folder she had been clutching and pulled out the forged property deed. She practically shoved the papers into the chest of the police captain. She said, "This is my house, and this is the deed proving my husband and I are the sole legal owners." She told him I was just a bitter old woman who had been evicted this morning. Captain Davis took the documents and began reading carefully. He looked at the medical power of attorney form. He looked at my forged signature. He looked up at me and raised one eyebrow. He was a smart man. He knew the chief executive officer of a corporate trust would never sign over a multi-million-dollar estate using a crude medical emergency form. He knew the documents were fake just by looking at them. But he also knew that if he arrested her right now, the paperwork trail might be incomplete. I gave him a very slight nod. I wanted him to take the report. I wanted Chloe to officially present a forged document to a police captain. Presenting fake legal documents is a felony. Captain Davis understood my silent command perfectly. He turned to his younger partner and told him to officially document the deed and take a formal statement from Chloe. He asked Chloe to repeat her claims on the official record. Chloe was thrilled. She thought she was winning. She proudly stated her full name and date of birth. She pointed at the forged signature and explicitly told the officers she witnessed me sign the property over to her. She lied to the police with absolute confidence. She was enthusiastically digging her own grave deeper with every single word she spoke. Richard also gave a lengthy formal statement. He backed up his daughter's ridiculous lies completely. He told the younger officer he had witnessed the transfer of the property and that I was unstable. He lied on an official police report to protect his daughter and secure his free place to live forever. He did not know he was committing a crime right alongside her. I stood perfectly still and listened to them weave their toxic web of deception. I did not interrupt them. I did not shout. They were lying. I simply let the officers write down every fraudulent claim in silence. I was building an ironclad case against them both. Once the formal statements were officially recorded, Captain Davis closed his notebook. He looked at Chloe, and then he looked at me. He said, "Ma'am, you cannot stay inside this house tonight if the homeowners want you gone." He told me this was now a civil matter regarding property disputes between family members. He said for the time being I needed to step outside to prevent further domestic disturbances. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. She crossed her arms tightly and smirked at me, dropping her crying act. She told me to get out of her house immediately and never come back. She thought she successfully intimidated me with the law. I looked at Captain Davis and nodded my head slowly in compliance. I told him I completely understood his position and I would gladly step outside to keep the peace. I said I did not want to cause any more stress for the poor, exhausted pregnant woman. I laced my words with heavy, biting sarcasm, but kept my tone completely polite. Chloe glared at me with pure hatred, but she was too busy gloating to realize what was actually happening. I turned around and walked slowly toward the back of the house. I told them I would simply step out onto the patio and wait for my private transportation. I pushed open the heavy French doors and stepped out into the warm afternoon air. The classical string quartet was still playing beautiful music. The wealthy guests were still drinking champagne and laughing on the manicured lawn. I walked out onto the stone patio, leaving Chloe and her father inside with the police officers. They thought they had expelled me from the house forever. They thought the police validated their fake documents, but they were both entirely wrong about everything. By officially presenting that forged property deed to a police captain, Chloe had committed a massive federal crime. The trap had locked permanently. I was standing comfortably on my wide stone patio, waiting for the final act to begin. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the Atlanta sky, casting long, elegant shadows across my manicured back lawn. I walked away from the French doors, leaving Chloe and her father inside with Captain Davis. I took a deep breath of the fresh air scented with blooming jasmine. The patio had been transformed into a makeshift auction house. Rows of white wooden folding chairs were arranged neatly on the grass, facing a small wooden podium. A man in a sharp gray suit stood behind the podium, adjusting a microphone. He was a professional auctioneer Chloe had clearly hired to legitimize her little theft operation. My personal belongings were stacked on tables waiting to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. The wealthy guests were finishing their champagne and slowly taking their seats. I saw women draped in expensive silk and men wearing casual but costly linen suits. They were laughing and pointing at my things, treating my treasured memories like cheap novelties at a flea market. I walked quietly to the very back row and stood near a large stone planter. Resting on the back of an empty chair was a numbered white plastic bidding paddle. I reached out and picked it up, feeling the smooth plastic beneath my fingers. I did not sit down. I wanted to remain standing so I could see every single face in the crowd when the truth finally came out. A few moments later, Chloe stepped out onto the patio. She looked slightly flustered from her encounter with the police, but she quickly plastered that fake bright smile back onto her face. She practically skipped to the front of the crowd and grabbed the microphone from the auctioneer. She thanked everyone for coming to her lovely new home. She announced that they were going to start the bidding with a few pieces of old wall art that simply did not fit her modern aesthetic vision for the estate. She gestured to two men in black shirts who carefully carried a large framed painting and placed it on an easel next to the podium. I looked at the painting and felt a familiar warmth in my chest. It was a stunning, vibrant piece depicting a scene from the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The colors were rich, deep blues and fiery oranges, capturing the raw emotion and undeniable strength of my ancestors. It was painted by a highly revered African-American artist who had passed away 2 decades ago. The piece was not just art, it was a profound piece of cultural history. I had spent years tracking it down and negotiating its purchase. To me, it was priceless. To the art world, it was easily worth $200,000. Chloe stood next to the masterpiece and wrinkled her nose in disgust. She told her friends that she found this dark, depressing thing hanging in the main hallway and wanted it gone immediately. She looked directly at a blonde woman sitting in the front row. The woman was wearing a massive diamond necklace and holding a small designer dog. Chloe laughed and said she would start the bidding incredibly low just to get it off her property. She asked for an opening bid of $1,000. The auctioneer took the microphone back and began his rapid-fire chanting, asking for $1,000. The blonde woman in the front row lazily raised her paddle. She offered $5,000, saying she would take it to hang in her pool house just to help Chloe clean out the junk. I felt a cold, sharp smile form on my lips. Chloe and her ignorant friends were treating a piece of profound history like a discarded rag. The auctioneer smiled at the blonde woman and asked the crowd if anyone wanted to bid $6,000. He scanned the rows of chairs, not expecting any serious competition for a piece the hostess had just openly insulted. I slowly raised the white plastic paddle high into the air. I did not say a word. I just let the number face the auctioneer. He spotted me standing in the back and immediately pointed his gavel in my direction. He announced loudly to the crowd that he had a bid for $6,000 from the lady standing in the back. Every single head in the audience turned around to look at me. The polite murmurs of the crowd completely died away. Chloe whipped her head around, her eyes widening in absolute shock. She thought I had been escorted off the premises by the police. Seeing me standing comfortably on my own patio, actively participating in her illegal auction, made her face turn a deep mottled red. She dropped her champagne flute onto the grass. She marched aggressively up to the auctioneer and grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the microphone. She hissed at him loud enough for the first few rows to hear, telling him to ignore my bid. She claimed I was a disgruntled trespasser who did not have a dime to my name. The auctioneer looked incredibly uncomfortable. He was a professional hired by an estate liquidator, and he was legally bound to accept valid bids. He gently pulled his arm away from Chloe and whispered something back to her. He was likely explaining that an open auction required him to acknowledge all raised paddles unless there was proof of insolvency. Chloe was furious, but she did not want to cause a massive screaming scene in front of her country club friends. She glared at me with absolute venom and stepped back from the podium. She gave the blonde woman in the front row a desperate nod, signaling her to bid higher. The auctioneer stepped back to the microphone and asked for $7,000. The blonde woman looked confused, but she obediently raised her paddle again. The auctioneer called out $7,000. I immediately raised my paddle again. $8,000. The blonde woman frowned and raised hers. $9,000. I raised mine without a second of hesitation. $10,000. The crowd started whispering excitedly. They thought they were witnessing a thrilling society bidding war over a mysterious piece of art. They had absolutely no idea they were watching a homeowner fight to protect her own stolen property from a group of arrogant thieves. Chloe was practically vibrating with rage. She marched down the center aisle, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. Chloe stopped 2 feet in front of me, blocking my view of the podium. She spoke through clenched teeth, her voice dripping with malice. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. She told me I was completely broke and that I could not afford to pay $10,000 for a dusty old painting. She said the police were going to come outside any second and drag me away for disturbing the peace. I looked down at her. She was so small, so incredibly foolish, and so hopelessly out of her depth. I lowered my bidding paddle and let it rest gently against my leg. I looked past her to the blonde woman in the front row who was staring at us with wide, curious eyes. I pitched my voice so that it carried clearly over the quiet patio. I said, $10,000 is a very generous bid for pool house decor. The blonde woman smiled proudly, thinking she had won the prize. Then I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Chloe to step backward. I looked directly at the blonde woman and addressed the entire crowd. I told them the painting on the easel was indeed a beautiful rendering of a historically significant moment. I explained that the original piece was painted by a master and was currently valued by art appraisers at roughly $200,000. A collective gasp rippled through the seated guests. The blonde woman suddenly looked thrilled, thinking she had just purchased a masterpiece for a fraction of its true value. Then I delivered the final crushing blow. I smiled at the blonde woman and told her it was such a shame that she was only bidding on a replica. The crowd went dead silent. I explained that I had commissioned a high-quality canvas print of the painting to hang in my hallway because I loved looking at it every day. I told them I donated the actual, authentic, original painting to the High Museum of Art in downtown Atlanta 3 years ago. I said it was currently sitting safely inside their climate-controlled vault behind 4 inches of bulletproof glass. I turned my eyes back to Chloe, who looked like she had just been slapped across the face. I told the crowd that it seemed the lovely hostess was trying to scam her dearest friends into paying thousands of dollars for a fake painting at a fake estate sale. The patio erupted into shocked whispers and angry murmurs. The blonde woman immediately threw her plastic paddle onto the grass, crossing her arms in sheer disgust. She glared at Chloe as if she were a common criminal. The rest of the guests began looking at the other items on the tables with deep suspicion. The illusion of Chloe being a wealthy, generous heiress shattered instantly. She was standing in front of her entire social circle, exposed as a fraud, trying to peddle fake art. I stood there watching her face crumble. I took a slow sip of water from a glass I picked up off a passing tray. She wanted a public spectacle, and I had just given her one. The dismantling of her fake life was progressing exactly as I had planned. The patio was still buzzing with the chaotic energy of my revelation about the replica painting. I stepped away from the crowd and found a quiet corner near the stone fountains. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, dramatic shadows across the grass. Chloe had retreated inside the house, her face flushed with absolute humiliation. She thought she could hide from the embarrassment, but her nightmare was only just beginning. The head caterer, a tall, stern man in a crisp white shirt, had been patiently waiting for her near the kitchen. He held a black leather folder containing the bill. The final invoice for the lavish spread of caviar truffles and vintage champagne she had ordered to impress her friends was enormous. The bill was easily over $15,000. Chloe handed him her platinum credit card without even looking at the total. She was too busy texting her friends trying to do damage control regarding the fake art scandal. The caterer swiped the card through his mobile payment device. The machine beeped a sharp, unpleasant sound. It displayed a red error message indicating the card was declined. The caterer cleared his throat and politely informed Chloe of the issue. He asked if she had another form of payment. Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a loud sigh of annoyance. She snatched the card back and told him the machine was obviously broken. She demanded he swipe it again. He obliged, but the result was exactly the same. Declined. A cold flash of panic briefly crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with her usual arrogance. She told the caterer to wait right there while she contacted her husband to transfer the funds. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, her long fingernails tapping the glass screen. She sent Marcus a desperate text message demanding he move $20,000 into her checking account immediately. Marcus was standing in the grand hallway trying to avoid the gossiping guests when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and read his wife's frantic message. He let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. He opened his mobile banking application expecting to see the massive balance he had grown accustomed to over the years. But when the screen loaded, Marcus completely froze. He blinked several times, convinced there was a glitch in the expensive banking system network. His primary checking account, which normally held hundreds of thousands of dollars, showed a balance of exactly zero. His high-yield savings account showed exactly zero. The joint account he had recently set up for Chloe was completely locked. Across the top of his phone screen, a bold red banner read, "Account suspended. Please contact your financial institution." A tight knot of absolute terror formed in his stomach. He stepped away from the lingering guests and quickly dialed his private wealth manager at the bank. The phone rang only once before an automated voice informed him of his current status. His accounts were frozen due to a direct mandate from the Sterling Family Trust. The automated voice stated that all access to funds had been permanently revoked, pending an investigation into fraudulent activities. Marcus dropped his phone. It clattered against the marble floor, but he did not even reach down to pick it up. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him like a concrete wall. The money was gone. His luxurious life was entirely funded by a trust he did not control. He remembered my cold silence in the study earlier. He remembered me telling him the truth. I was the one who funded his existence. He finally understood what he had done. He had chosen to support his wife in stealing a house from the very woman who held the keys to his entire financial universe. Marcus burst through the French doors, practically tearing them off their hinges. He marched out onto the patio, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He scanned the crowd until his eyes locked onto me, standing calmly by the fountain. He pushed past the wealthy guests, ignoring their shocked whispers. He stopped right in front of me, breathing heavily now. His chest was heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. He looked absolutely terrified. He asked me what I had done to his bank accounts. His voice was shaking barely above a whisper. He told me his cards were declining and his entire portfolio was locked. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, savoring the cool liquid. I looked at him with an expression of complete indifference. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I reminded him that he was a brilliant and successful trauma surgeon who did not need help. He did not need his mother's help to provide for his new family. Marcus shook his head desperately. He stepped closer, begging me to stop playing games. He said the caterers were threatening to pack up all the food and leave if they were not paid in the next 10 minutes. He admitted that he did not have the money to cover the party. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the exact words he needed to hear. I told him the Sterling Family Trust was managed by a very strict board of directors, protecting all our assets. I explained that the trust protocol automatically freezes all beneficiary assets the moment it detects a severe legal violation or fraudulent activity. I smiled a cold, empty smile. I said, "It seems someone forged a signature on a highly sensitive legal document today, Marcus. The trust administrators simply acted to protect the family assets from criminals. Your accounts are not just frozen, they are completely terminated." Marcus physically stumbled backward as if I had struck him in the chest. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire house burn to the ground. He stood there paralyzed, absolutely. Paralyzed by his own foolishness, he could not speak. While he stood there, Chloe came rushing out onto the patio. She was followed closely by her parents, Richard and Susan Kensington. Chloe was practically hyperventilating. She grabbed Marcus by the arm and demanded to know why the money had not been transferred. She said the caterers were actively carrying trays of food out to their vans in front of the entire country club. Marcus looked at his wife with a hollow, dead expression. He told her the money was gone. He said the trust had completely cut him off today, cut off because of the forged property deed. Chloe stared at him, her mouth hanging open in absolute disbelief. She shook her head aggressively, refusing to accept reality. She told him to just call the bank and fix it. She yelled at him to use his own salary from the hospital. Marcus laughed a dry, broken sound. He explained that his hospital salary was funneled through the exact same frozen accounts. He had absolutely nothing, not a single penny. The color completely drained from Chloe's face. But the most spectacular reaction came from her parents standing right behind her now. Richard Kensington grabbed his daughter's shoulder, his fingers digging into her silk dress. He demanded to know what Marcus meant by the money being gone. Richard looked frantic, his previous arrogance completely erased by sheer panic. He told Chloe that she had explicitly promised him a massive cash bailout by the end of the week. He reminded her that his shipping company was defaulting on a $4 million commercial loan tomorrow morning. He said he had already told his creditors that his wealthy son-in-law was covering the debt. Susan Kensington gasped, clutching her chest, rapidly losing breath. She looked at her husband and then at her daughter, realizing the horrifying truth. The massive fortune they thought they had secured by marrying Chloe to Marcus was completely unreachable. They had banked their entire financial survival on my money. They had treated me like dirt while secretly depending on my wealth to save them from total ruin. Richard began pacing back and forth, running his hands through his thinning hair. He muttered that he was going to lose everything. He said the bank would seize his house, his cars, and his business. Susan started crying real tears of despair. She wailed that they would be entirely disgraced in their social circle. The elegant garden party had devolved into a complete nightmare for the Kensington family. Their wealthy friends were watching them unravel right on the manicured lawn. The facade of the rich, powerful family was cracking and shattering into a million pieces. Chloe looked around frantically, realizing her perfect plan had just detonated in her face. She had tried to steal my house, but instead she had triggered a financial earthquake that was swallowing her and her parents whole. I stood perfectly still, watching the glorious destruction unfold completely. The financial devastation on the patio left Chloe and her parents in a state of absolute shock. Chloe could not handle the public humiliation of her friends, watching her empire crumble before it even began. She spun around and practically ran back toward the French doors. She pushed her way inside the house, trying to escape the whispers and the stares. I did not let her escape. I walked steadily across the stone patio and followed her inside. I stepped through the doors and let them shut behind me, blocking out the noise of the garden party. I found her pacing frantically in the long corridor that connected the formal dining room to the main foyer. The hallway was lined with tall mirrors and expensive floral arrangements. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she tried to formulate a new plan to save herself. When she saw me walking toward her, the panic in her eyes instantly transformed into pure, unadulterated rage. She realized she was trapped with the one person who saw through every single one of her lies. She did not hold back. Chloe launched into a vicious screaming match the moment I stepped into the hallway. She shrieked that I was a monster who was deliberately trying to destroy my own son's happiness. Her voice was so loud and shrill it echoed sharply off the high ceilings and the glass mirrors. She demanded that I march right back outside and call my bank to restore the funds immediately. She told me I had no right to freeze the accounts because she was carrying the next generation of the Sterling family. She used her supposed pregnancy as a shield, just like she had been doing all morning. She placed both of her hands protectively over her perfectly flat stomach and sobbed fake tears. She yelled that the stress I was causing could harm her unborn baby and that Marcus would never forgive me if she lost the child. She screamed that she was the mother of his first baby, and that gave her absolute authority over the estate and the finances. She called me a bitter old woman who was just jealous because Marcus loved her more than he loved me. Every word she screamed was designed to inflict maximum emotional damage, but I did not feel a single sting. I stood perfectly still, letting her scream herself hoarse. I watched her face turn bright red and the veins stand out on her neck. When she finally ran out of breath and stopped yelling, the silence in the hallway was deafening. I looked at her hands still resting on her stomach, playing the role of the protective mother. I felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I told her she was a phenomenal actress, but her script was full of holes. I explained that when she came to me crying about her secret $80,000 credit card debt 2 years ago, I realized I could never trust her again. I told her I did not just pay off her debt and forget about it. I hired a private investigator to run a comprehensive background check on her and her entire family. I told her my investigator had been monitoring her public movements and financial transactions ever since the wedding to ensure she did not bankrupt my son. I explained exactly how the private investigator had gathered the evidence. I told her he had been following her for weeks, taking photographs of her shopping sprees and recording her conversations in public spaces. I told her I knew about the expensive lunches she bought for her friends using my son's credit card. I knew about the secret bank account she had opened in her mother's name to slowly siphon funds away from the joint marital account. The private investigator had compiled a dossier thicker than a phone book, detailing every single lie she had told since the day she walked down the aisle. She was utterly surrounded by the evidence of her own greed. There was no lie she could invent to escape the concrete proof I held in my hand. Chloe dropped her hands from her stomach and took a step backward. The fake tears completely stopped. She stared at my phone with a look of absolute dread. I tapped the screen and opened an audio file my private investigator had sent me just 2 days ago. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed play. The clear sound of Chloe's own voice filled the quiet hallway. She was sitting in a luxury coffee shop talking loudly to her best friend over iced lattes. On the recording, her friend asked how she managed to convince Marcus to sign a legal medical document without him getting suspicious. Chloe's recorded voice laughed a cruel, calculating laugh. The recording played her exact words, explaining her entire fraudulent scheme. She bragged to her friend that she simply printed a fake ultrasound picture off an internet website and showed it to Marcus while he was half asleep after a 30-hour surgical shift. She said he started crying tears of joy and signed the medical power of attorney without even reading the fine print because she claimed it was required by her new obstetrician. The recording continued playing her toxic words. She told her friend that she was not actually pregnant and that she planned to stage a tragic miscarriage right after the house deed was officially processed in her name. She said Marcus would be so devastated by the fake loss of the baby that he would never question the property transfer. She called my son a gullible fool who was too blinded by love to see what she was doing. I pressed a button on the screen and stopped the audio. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Chloe looked completely paralyzed. Her face was ashen and her mouth was opening and closing, but absolutely no sound came out. The reflection of her horrified face was visible in every single mirror lining the corridor. Her ultimate weapon had just been completely destroyed. She could no longer hide behind the sacred shield of motherhood. She was exposed as a ruthless predator who was willing to fake a pregnancy and a miscarriage just to steal a house and secure a free lifestyle for her bankrupt parents. Marcus had always wanted to be a father. Ever since he was a young boy, playing in the gardens of this very estate, he talked about having a large family. Chloe knew this. She knew his deep desire for children was his greatest vulnerability. She weaponized his dream against him. The sheer cruelty required to look a man in the eyes and promise him a child while secretly plotting to stage a tragic medical emergency to break his heart was unfathomable. It takes a truly dark and hollow soul to manufacture a fake life just to steal a piece of real estate. I looked at her sitting on the floor and felt an overwhelming sense of disgust. She was not just a thief, she was an emotional terrorist. She leaned heavily against the wall as if her legs could no longer support her weight. The confident, arrogant woman who had told me to go back to the projects this morning was entirely gone. She was trembling violently, shaking her head from side to side in desperate denial. She whispered that the recording was fake and that I had somehow manufactured it to frame her. She tried to say she really was pregnant, but she could not even look me in the eye when she said it. I stepped closer to her, invading her personal space. I told her my investigator had already pulled her medical records from her actual gynecologist. I told her the doctor confirmed she was actively refilling her birth control prescription every single month, including this morning. There was absolutely no baby. There was never going to be a baby. The entire pregnancy was a disgusting fabrication constructed solely to manipulate my brilliant but emotionally vulnerable son into signing over a $2.5 million estate. Chloe slid slowly down the wall until she was sitting on the hardwood floor, her designer dress pooling around her. She looked up at me with tears of genuine terror streaming down her face. She begged me not to tell Marcus. She sobbed, clutching at the hem of my suit jacket. She said if Marcus heard that recording, he would leave her immediately, and she would have absolutely nothing. I looked down at her and gently pulled my jacket out of her desperate grasp. I told her I was not going to tell Marcus a single thing about the fake pregnancy. She stopped crying for a fraction of a second, looking up at me with a glimmer of pathetic hope. She thought I was going to show her mercy. I quickly crushed that hope into dust. I told her I was not going to tell him because she was going to do it herself. I looked at my watch, noting the exact time. I told her the 1-hour countdown started right now. I explained the exact sequence of events that would follow if she chose to defy me. I said if she tried to run away, or if she tried to spin another lie to Marcus, I would not just play the recording for the party guests. I would personally send the audio file to the medical board where Marcus worked, ensuring every doctor and nurse knew exactly what kind of woman he had married. I would send the dossier to the local newspapers. I would make sure her name became synonymous with fraud and manipulation in the city of Atlanta. She would never be able to show her face in high society ever again. I told her she had two choices. She could confess and face the private destruction of her marriage, or she could remain silent and face absolute public annihilation. The choice was entirely hers, but the outcome was going to be exactly the same. She was going to lose everything. I leaned down so my face was only inches from hers. My voice was quiet, but completely lethal. I told her she had exactly 1 hour to walk out to the patio, pull Marcus aside, and tell him the truth about the fake internet ultrasound. I told her she was going to look him in the eye and admit that she used a fake baby to steal his inheritance. I told her if she did not confess within 60 minutes, I would play the audio recording on the massive smart television in the living room for every single guest to hear. I would let her entire country club social circle listen to her plotting a fake miscarriage over luxury iced lattes. I stood back up and smoothed my jacket. I told her that when Marcus inevitably left her after hearing the truth, she would not get a single dime of my family money in the divorce. I promised her I would hire the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state of Georgia to ensure she walked away with nothing but the clothes on her back and a felony forgery charge. I turned around and began walking back toward the patio, leaving her sitting on the floor in a puddle of her own catastrophic lies. "You have 1 hour, Chloe," I said without looking back. The 60-minute countdown had officially come to an end. I had left Chloe sitting on the hardwood floor of the interior corridor, giving her exactly 1 hour to confess her massive web of lies to her husband. A smart woman would have taken that time to pull Marcus aside and admit the truth in private. A rational human being would have recognized that the war was entirely lost and that walking away quietly was the only viable option for survival. But Chloe was not a rational human being. She was an entitled, cornered animal functioning purely on arrogance and desperation. Instead of accepting her defeat and trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left, she decided to double down on her delusions. She chose the path of total public annihilation. Within 15 minutes of our hallway confrontation, Chloe emerged from the back doors of the house. She had reapplied her expensive makeup and smoothed the wrinkles out of her white designer dress. She marched out onto the stone patio with a terrifying manic energy radiating from her every movement. She knew her wealthy parents were starting to panic. She knew her country club social circle was growing highly suspicious after the incident with the replica painting earlier in the afternoon. She needed to regain complete control of the narrative before the whispers turned into loud accusations. She began clapping her hands loudly, herding her wealthy friends toward the massive formal dining tables set up on the manicured lawn. The catering staff had already placed the lavish dinner spread onto the buffet tables before her credit card was declined. Chloe frantically urged everyone to sit down and begin the evening meal. She was desperate to create the picture-perfect image of a wealthy, generous hostess in total control of her domain. She guided her parents, Richard and Susan Kensington, to the beautifully decorated seats of honor at the very head of the main table. Richard was sweating profusely. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking violently as he pulled out his wooden chair. He knew his failing regional shipping business was going to be completely liquidated tomorrow morning by my corporate firm, but he forced a tight, terrifying smile for the sake of the surrounding guests. Susan sat rigidly beside her husband, clutching her silk dinner napkin like a lifeline in a storm. They were all playing their specific parts in a completely fabricated reality. Chloe darted around the tables, directing her friends to their designated seats and pouring expensive wine with a trembling, desperate hand. I did not join the main group of guests. I remained seated at a small, empty iron table near the far edge of the rose garden. I sat perfectly still, observing the chaotic and lavish dinner party unfold under the setting sun. I watched Marcus slowly walk out of the French doors and step onto the lawn. He looked absolutely and entirely defeated. His broad shoulders were slumped forward, and his dark eyes were hollow and completely empty. He knew that his entire financial universe had just been frozen and confiscated by the family trust administrators. He knew he had absolutely no money to pay for the extravagant food sitting on the tables right in front of him. But he still did not know the darkest, most twisted truth of all. He did not know that his wife's pregnancy was a complete and total internet fabrication designed solely to steal my property. Chloe rushed over to Marcus and grabbed his arm. Her sharp, manicured fingernails dug deeply into the fabric of his tailored suit jacket. She pulled him aggressively toward the front of the main dining table, forcing him to stand right beside her in front of the massive crowd. Marcus looked exactly like a prisoner being led to a public execution. He did not look at his wealthy friends, and he absolutely refused to look in my direction. He simply stared blankly at the green grass beneath his expensive leather shoes. Chloe reached over and picked up a tall, crystal champagne flute. She grabbed a heavy silver spoon from the table setting. She began clinking the metal spoon against the delicate glass, producing a sharp, continuous ringing sound that echoed across the quiet evening garden. The lively chatter of the wealthy guests slowly faded into complete silence as they turned their full attention to their frantic hostess. Chloe stood incredibly tall and plastered a wide, beaming smile across her face. It was the most terrifying and artificial smile I had ever witnessed in my entire life. She welcomed her guests to the dinner, thanking them profusely for attending her grand housewarming celebration. Her voice was slightly too loud and pitched noticeably higher than normal, betraying her deep, underlying panic to anyone paying close attention. She declared to the entire crowd that today was a monumental and historic day for the Kensington family and her new marriage. She announced proudly that she and Marcus had officially finalized the legal paperwork this morning and were now the sole legal owners of this beautiful, historic Atlanta estate. She spread her arms wide, claiming my house, my land, and my lifelong legacy as her own personal triumph. Several guests politely clapped their hands and murmured their congratulations. Chloe soaked up the scattered applause like a dying plant drinking water in the desert. It gave her a temporary false sense of absolute security. She turned to Marcus and placed a dramatic, loving hand on his broad shoulder. She told the listening crowd that owning this massive property was only the very beginning of their joyous journey together. She took a deep, dramatic breath and announced her supposed pregnancy to the entire social circle. She claimed they were eagerly expecting their first child and that this sprawling estate was going to be the perfect, safe place to raise the next generation of their growing family. The crowd erupted into much louder applause and excited cheers. Wealthy women raised their crystal glasses in the air in joyful celebration. Marcus visibly flinched when she mentioned the unborn baby. He forced a very weak, trembling smile for his cheering friends, but the profound sorrow in his eyes was unmistakable to me. He felt like a complete failure of a man because he truly believed he could no longer financially provide for this innocent child. He was actively grieving the sudden loss of his financial security while standing directly next to a woman who was faking the very child he was grieving for. Chloe leaned into him, resting her blonde head on his shoulder, playing the perfect picture of a devoted and loving mother-to-be. She looked across the sea of smiling faces and felt entirely invincible once again. She actually believed that if she announced these massive lies in front of enough important people, the lies would magically transform into the truth. But Chloe was not completely satisfied with simply claiming her fake victory over the estate. She needed to completely humiliate and destroy me in front of her peers to secure her absolute social dominance. She scanned the darkening garden until her eyes finally found me sitting quietly in the shadows at the back table. She raised her crystal champagne glass directly in my direction and called out my name for everyone to hear. The entire crowd turned in their wooden chairs to look at me. Chloe smiled with venomous, sickening sweetness. She publicly thanked me for stepping aside and gracefully handing over the property to the younger generation. She said it was incredibly brave of me to recognize that I was no longer capable of managing such a massive, complicated estate entirely on my own. The wealthy guests looked at me with varying degrees of confusion and deep pity. Chloe deliberately lowered her voice to a dramatic, sympathetic whisper, but made sure it was still loud enough to carry across the quiet lawn. She told the crowd that they should all be very gentle and patient with me this evening. She claimed with absolute fake sorrow that I had recently been diagnosed by specialists with severe early-onset dementia. She told her friends that my mind was rapidly deteriorating and that I often became terribly confused about where I lived and who actually owned my personal belongings. She told them this tragic medical condition was the real reason I had tried to bid on my own fake painting earlier and why I was still wandering aimlessly around the property, refusing to leave. A collective murmur of profound pity rippled through the seated guests. Women covered their mouths in shock and whispered quietly to their husbands. They looked at me as if I were a tragic, broken shell of a human being entirely detached from reality. Richard and Susan Kensington nodded solemnly from the head table, eagerly playing along with the vicious lie to protect their own interests. Marcus snapped his head up and stared at his wife in absolute pure horror. He knew I did not have dementia. He knew I was sharper and more dangerous than any single person sitting at that table, but he was too weak and completely paralyzed by his own financial ruin to speak up and defend his mother. He just stood there frozen, letting his wife publicly assassinate my character in front of the entire country club. Chloe looked at me with a triumphant, arrogant smirk. She thought she had just played the ultimate, undeniable trump card. By publicly labeling me as mentally unstable, she truly believed she had invalidated anything I might say or do for the rest of the evening. She calculated that if I yelled, they would simply say I was having a dementia episode. If I claimed she forged the property deed, they would say I was confused and highly delusional. She thought she had completely neutralized my ability to fight back. She raised her glass one final time and proposed a toast to new beginnings and the preservation of strong family legacies. The guests raised their glasses high into the air and drank the expensive vintage champagne that I had personally paid for. I did not react to the massive public insult. I did not cry out in anger, and I certainly did not look the least bit confused. I sat perfectly still and looked down at my gold designer watch. The minute hand clicked precisely onto the 12. Exactly 60 minutes had passed since I left Chloe sobbing on the hallway floor. I gave her 1 full hour to tell the truth and save herself from total public destruction. She chose to use that precious hour to call me crazy and attempt to steal my home in front of a live audience. Her time was officially up. The grace period I had generously offered was permanently over. I reached out and picked up the thick manila folder resting on the iron table beside my water glass. This was not the fake folder Chloe had thrown at me this morning in the kitchen. This was a brand new folder that my lead corporate attorney Jonathan had hand-delivered to my private security team just 20 minutes ago. It contained the absolute, unvarnished, undeniable truth. It contained the real certified property deeds, the official financial trust records, the Kensington bankruptcy filings, and the devastating private investigator reports regarding the fake pregnancy. It was a loaded weapon cleverly disguised as a stack of ordinary paper. I pushed my iron chair back, letting the metal legs scrape loudly against the stone patio surface. I stood up slowly and very deliberately. I smoothed the front of my dark tailored suit jacket, ensuring I looked the absolute picture of corporate authority. I held the manila folder firmly in my right hand, resting it against my side. The very moment I stood up, the quiet murmurs of pity among the wealthy guests immediately stopped. The sound of clinking silverware and crystal glasses ceased completely. The entire lavish garden party went dead silent. Hundreds of eyes locked onto me, waiting anxiously to see what the supposedly confused old woman was going to do next. Chloe slowly lowered her champagne flute, her triumphant, arrogant smile freezing and then rapidly melting away from her face. She saw the thick folder in my hand. She saw the cold, absolute clarity and fierce intelligence burning in my eyes. She knew exactly what was about to happen, and she could not do a single thing to stop the incoming destruction. The entire garden went completely silent the moment I stood up from my iron chair. Hundreds of wealthy guests stopped breathing, waiting to see what the supposedly crazy old woman was going to do next. Chloe stood at the head of the lavish dining table, her crystal champagne flute trembling in her hand. The arrogant smile she wore just seconds ago melted away, leaving behind a mask of pure terror. I held the thick manila folder at my side and began walking slowly across the manicured lawn. I did not walk toward the dining tables. I walked directly past them, heading straight for the open French doors that led into the massive formal living room. The guests turned in their chairs, following my every move with wide, curious eyes. The living room was completely visible from the patio, and mounted on the far wall was an enormous 85-inch smart television. I stepped inside the house and picked up the small silver remote control resting on the coffee table. I pressed a single button, turning the massive screen on. The bright digital light illuminated the darkening room. I pulled my smartphone from my tailored jacket pocket and quickly synced it to the television. I was about to give Chloe the exact public spectacle she had been desperately craving all day. I opened the secure digital file my lead corporate attorney had sent me and mirrored my phone screen to the massive television. A high-resolution scan of a legal document appeared on the screen, towering over everyone. The text was large enough for the guests sitting at the back of the garden to read perfectly. I turned around and walked back out onto the stone patio facing the silent crowd. I looked directly at Chloe, whose face had turned the color of chalk. I pitched my voice so it carried clearly over the quiet evening air. I told the guests to direct their attention to the screen behind me. I explained that what they were looking at was the sole authentic and legally binding deed to this $2.5 million estate. I said it was the exact same document filed with the county clerk office many years ago. I invited anyone with a pair of reading glasses to look very closely at the section listing the legal property owner. The guests leaned forward, squinting at the bright screen. I did not make them guess. I read the name out loud myself. The property owner was not Marcus. The property owner was absolutely not Chloe. The legal owner, printed in bold black ink, was Sterling Corporate Holdings. A wave of confused whispers washed over the dining tables. People were looking back and forth between the screen and Marcus. Marcus was standing perfectly still, his head bowed completely in shame. He knew exactly what that document meant. I looked at the crowd and explained the reality of my family finances. I told them I built a massive commercial real estate empire from absolutely nothing. I said I transferred all my personal assets into a highly secure corporate trust decades ago to protect my legacy. I looked directly at Marcus and told the crowd that my son was a brilliant surgeon, but he did not own a single brick of this massive estate. I explained that the trust administrators simply granted him a revocable license to reside on the property. I made sure to emphasize the word revocable. I told them a revocable license meant he was essentially a permanent guest, allowed to live here completely free of charge, as long as he abided by the strict legal rules of the trust. He had absolutely no equity. He had absolutely no ownership rights to transfer to anyone else. He was just a tenant living in a house owned by a multi-million-dollar corporation. Then I turned my full attention to Chloe. She was physically leaning against the dining table to keep herself from collapsing onto the grass. I told the crowd that my new daughter-in-law decided she did not want to be a simple guest in my home. I explained that she wanted to be the queen of the castle, and she was willing to do absolutely anything to steal the crown. I pointed at the television screen, and then I pulled the fake deed from my manila folder, holding it high in the air. I told the guests that Chloe used a medical power of attorney designed for hospital emergencies to draft this completely fraudulent document this morning. I explained that she forged my signature at the bottom and tried to file it to illegally transfer the estate into her own name. The wealthy guests gasped loudly. Several women covered their mouths in absolute horror. Stealing was one thing, but forging legal documents in their social circle was an unforgivable scandal. I told them Chloe had proudly handed me this fake eviction notice at 7 o'clock this morning and told me to go back to the projects. I walked slowly toward the head of the table where Chloe and her parents were standing. Richard and Susan Kensington looked like they were going to be violently ill. They realized their daughter had not just lied to them, she had committed a massive federal crime. I stopped a few feet away from Chloe, looking down at her trembling frame. I told her in a voice as cold as ice that she made a catastrophic miscalculation today. I explained that if she had simply forged a document to steal a house from a retired old woman, she might have faced a mild civil lawsuit. But I told her she did not try to steal from an old woman. She tried to steal a primary asset from a ruthless corporate entity. I explained the law to her very clearly in front of all her friends. I said forging real estate documents to defraud a multi-million-dollar corporation is a Class C felony in this state. I told her the corporate fraud division of the police department takes those crimes incredibly seriously. I reminded her of the police officers who visited the house just a few hours ago. I looked around at the guests and explained the brilliance of what happened earlier this afternoon. I told them Chloe had called emergency services, claiming I was an aggressive intruder trespassing on her property. I explained that when the police captain arrived, Chloe proudly handed him the fake deed to prove she was the owner. I smiled a dark, satisfied smile. I told Chloe that by handing that forged document to a sworn police captain and verbally declaring it was real, she officially committed a federal crime on the police record. I told her she provided the authorities with the exact physical evidence they needed to lock her in a prison cell for the next 10 years. I explained that the police captain did not leave because he believed her lies. He left because I silently instructed him to take her formal statement and build an ironclad criminal case against her. She walked completely blindly into a legal bear trap, and she smiled while the steel jaws clamped shut around her ankles. The silence on the patio was now thick and suffocating. No one dared to take a single sip of champagne. The wealthy friends who had just applauded her pregnancy announcement were now staring at her with pure disgust and fear. They did not want to be associated with a convicted felon. Some of the guests slowly began pushing their wooden chairs back from the tables, preparing to flee the property before the authorities returned. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but she could only produce a pathetic, choking sound. She looked at her father, Richard, begging for help. But Richard physically stepped away from his own daughter, trying to distance himself from the radioactive fallout of her crimes. He knew his own business was bankrupt, and he could not afford to be tied to a felony forgery investigation. Chloe was completely and entirely isolated. She stood at the head of the lavish dinner table she had paid for, with a declined credit card, surrounded by friends who now despised her. She was a fake heiress, living in a stolen house, facing a decade in federal prison. And I was just getting started with my retaliation. The corporate deed was only the very first document in my folder. The silence on the patio after the revelation of the forged corporate deed hung in the air like a thick, heavy fog. The wealthy guests were staring at the massive television screen in the formal living room, trying to process the massive felony that had just been exposed. Chloe was completely frozen at the head of the dinner table, unable to speak or move. But her father, Richard Kensington, was a man built on aggressive pride and deeply ingrained racial arrogance. He could not stand the sight of a black woman holding absolute power over his family in front of his elite social circle. He forcefully pushed himself away from the dining table. His heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the stone patio, breaking the suffocating silence. He marched forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face and began to shout. He told the entire crowd not to listen to a single word I was saying. He yelled that I was a bitter, lying old woman who was simply jealous of his daughter's youth and beauty. He claimed the document displayed on the smart television was nothing but a cheap digital fabrication. He puffed out his chest and declared that he was a highly respected businessman who ran a massive regional shipping empire. He said he had a team of top-tier lawyers on permanent retainer and that he was going to sue me for every single penny I had. He threatened to file a massive defamation lawsuit against me first thing tomorrow morning for slandering his family name in front of the entire country club. He yelled that he would personally ensure I spent the rest of my miserable life living in a cardboard box on the street. I stood perfectly still and let him yell. I let him scream his empty threats into the cool evening air. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead and the veins bulge in his neck. He was trying so desperately to maintain his illusion of superiority. He wanted his wealthy friends to believe he was a powerful titan of industry defending his innocent daughter from a crazy, disgruntled mother-in-law. But his friends were not buying it anymore. They watched his aggressive outburst with growing distaste. They saw a red-faced, sweating man screaming at a calm, elegantly dressed woman who held a folder full of certified legal evidence. Richard kept shouting, trying to drown out the reality of the situation. He said his company was worth millions, and that my little corporate trust was nothing compared to the Kensington legacy. When he finally paused to take a breath, I simply raised my right hand. The gesture was small, but it carried so much absolute authority that Richard completely stopped talking. He stared at me, his chest heaving. I looked at him with an expression of cold, clinical pity. I told him he was right about one thing. I told him we absolutely needed to talk about his business and his precious legacy. I raised the small silver remote control in my left hand and pointed it toward the massive television screen inside the living room. I pressed the directional button exactly one time. The bright screen flickered for a fraction of a second, and the image of the forged property deed vanished completely. In its place, a brand new document appeared on the screen, towering over the silent garden party. It was not a single document. It was a comprehensive digital spread of highly confidential financial records. There were balance sheets, profit and loss statements, and massive commercial loan agreements. At the very top of the screen in large, bold letters was the name Kensington Regional Shipping. Below the company name were rows and rows of numbers highlighted in bright, glaring red. I turned slightly so I could look at the screen, and then I looked back at Richard. All the aggressive color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. He recognized those documents immediately. They were the highly guarded secrets he had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to hide from his wife, his daughter, and his elite social circle. He opened his mouth, but the loud, arrogant voice was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. I pitched my voice to be perfectly conversational, but crystal clear, so every single guest could hear the final nail being driven into the Kensington coffin. I told the crowd that Richard liked to boast about his massive regional shipping empire. I told them he liked to act like he was a king among peasants. But the numbers on the screen told a very different story. I walked slowly along the edge of the dining tables, making sure the wealthy guests were looking closely at the red numbers. I explained that Kensington Regional Shipping had been secretly bankrupt for years. I told them Richard had been taking out massive commercial loans just to cover his payroll and maintain his expensive country club memberships. I pointed to a specific document on the screen. I told the crowd that Richard owed exactly $4.2 million to a private investment bank in Chicago. I explained that he had used his own residential home, his luxury vehicles, and his entire business infrastructure as collateral for that massive unpayable loan. A loud collective gasp rippled through the seated guests. In their exclusive social circle, there was no sin greater than being secretly broke. They looked at Richard with absolute sheer revulsion. He had been drinking their wine and playing golf at their clubs while completely drowning in debt. He was a fraud. He was an imposter, parading around in expensive suits, bought on credit. Richard was physically shaking now. His hands were trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the dining table just to remain standing. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He finally realized exactly who he was dealing with. He realized I was not a retired school administrator. I was an apex predator in the corporate financial world, and he had just walked willingly into my territory. I stopped walking and stood directly in front of him. The distance between us was only a few feet, but the power dynamic was an unbridgeable ocean. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the second crushing blow of the evening. I told him that the investment bank in Chicago was growing very tired of his missed payments. I told him they were planning to call in his debt by the end of the month. I paused, letting the weight of the impending ruin settle heavily on his shoulders. Then I smiled a cold, ruthless smile. I told him he did not have to worry about the Chicago bank anymore. I told him that at exactly 9 o'clock this morning, while his daughter was parading around my kitchen in my stolen silk robe trying to evict me, I made a single phone call. I told him my corporate trust purchased his entire debt portfolio from the bank at a premium. I raised my voice so the entire garden could hear the absolute finality of my words. I told him, I bought your debt at 9 in the morning, Richard. I am your sole creditor. I own the commercial mortgage on your shipping warehouse. I own the title to your primary residence. I own the loans on your delivery trucks, and I own the massive credit lines funding your pathetic illusion of wealth. I own absolutely every single piece of your existence. You do not owe a faceless bank in Chicago anymore. You owe me $4.2 million, and I am calling the entire debt due immediately. The absolute shock of the revelation hit the Kensington family like a physical, explosive device. Richard let out a loud, guttural groan, and his knees physically buckled. He collapsed forward, catching himself heavily on the back of a wooden dining chair. He hung his head, his chest heaving with dry, ragged sobs. His shipping empire, his social standing, his entire life was completely destroyed in front of everyone he wanted to impress. But the most dramatic reaction came from his wife. Susan Kensington had been sitting rigidly in her chair, listening to her entire fake reality shatter into pieces. When I announced that I owned their home and their business, her eyes rolled back into her head. All the tension left her body at once. She let out a soft sigh and slumped completely out of her wooden chair. She collapsed onto the manicured grass, fainting completely dead away. Chaos immediately erupted around the head table. Chloe screamed and dropped to the grass beside her unconscious mother, slapping her cheeks and begging her to wake up. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the horrific scene, realizing the family he had married into was nothing but a house of cards that had just been flattened by a hurricane. The wealthy guests were standing up, backing away from the table, horrified by the absolute mess unfolding on the lawn. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the bankrupt, fraudulent Kensingtons. The catered food sat untouched on the tables. The string quartet had stopped playing long ago. The beautiful garden party had officially become a graveyard for the Kensington legacy. I looked down at Chloe crying over her fainting mother and Richard sobbing over his ruined business. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy. I checked the heavy gold designer watch on my wrist. I spoke one last time, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic noise. I told Richard he had exactly 5 minutes. I said, if you do not leave my property in 5 minutes, I am foreclosing on your home and liquidating your business by Monday morning. I told them their time was up and the eviction was now completely and permanently reversed. The patio was in a state of complete and utter pandemonium following my announcement regarding the Kensington bankruptcy. Susan Kensington was still lying unconscious on the manicured grass, while Richard hovered over her, completely paralyzed by his massive financial ruin. The wealthy guests were actively fleeing the property, eager to escape the toxic fallout of the evening, but my son Marcus was not looking at the fleeing guests or his ruined father-in-law. He was looking directly at me with eyes full of desperate pleading. He stepped away from the head table and walked slowly across the stone patio, closing the distance between us. His expensive tailored suit looked wrinkled, and his broad shoulders were slumped with the heavy weight of absolute defeat. He stopped just a few feet away from me. Marcus raised his hands in a gesture of complete surrender. He looked at me, and his voice cracked with raw emotional exhaustion. He begged me to stop the public destruction. He said he understood that Chloe had made a massive, unforgivable mistake by forging the property documents. He admitted that her parents were financially ruined and that they deserved to face the consequences of their massive debt. But he pleaded with me to show just a tiny fraction of mercy for his own sake. He told me that he was completely broken, but he still had to protect his growing family. He invoked the absolute ultimate emotional shield. He asked me to spare Chloe the stress of a criminal investigation for the sake of his unborn child. He told me that my future grandchild was the only pure and innocent thing left in this entire disastrous situation. He said the baby did not deserve to be born into a family torn apart by corporate lawsuits and felony charges. He begged me to let Chloe walk away quietly so she could have a peaceful pregnancy. He actually believed he was doing the right and honorable thing by defending the mother of his supposed child. He was willing to sacrifice his own dignity and forgive her massive criminal betrayal just to protect the baby he wanted so desperately. I looked at my brilliant son and felt my heart physically ache for the immense pain he was about to endure. I did not raise my voice when I responded to his desperate plea. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm that cut right through the chaotic noise of the ruined garden party. I told Marcus that his loyalty to his family was an admirable trait, but his absolute blindness to reality was going to completely destroy him. I told him he had spent his entire life studying science and medicine, relying on hard, concrete facts to save lives in the operating room. But when it came to his own personal life, he had completely abandoned all logic and reason. He had chosen to blindly trust a woman who had demonstrated time and time again that she was fundamentally incapable of telling the truth. I reached into the thick manila folder I was still holding in my left hand. I bypassed the corporate deeds and the bankruptcy filings and pulled out a smaller, sealed white envelope. The envelope was thick and heavy, containing documents that were going to permanently alter the trajectory of his entire existence. I held the white envelope out toward him. I told him that I did not need to hire a team of corporate hackers or break any privacy laws to obtain the absolute truth about his wife's medical condition. I explained that Chloe was incredibly arrogant, but she was also incredibly careless. I reminded him that she was completely fully insured under the highly exclusive Sterling corporate healthcare plan. I told Marcus that as the primary administrator of the corporate family trust, I received detailed, itemized billing statements for every single medical procedure charged to our premium insurance accounts. I explained that I noticed several massive discrepancies in her recent medical billing history. I told him Chloe had been charging the insurance company for routine gynecological checkups and monthly prescription refills, but she had never once submitted a single claim for an ultrasound or a prenatal consultation. I told him a woman who is supposedly several months pregnant does not continue to refill her monthly birth control prescriptions using the family insurance plan. Marcus stared at the white envelope in my hand, his eyes wide with growing, horrifying realization. I pushed the white envelope against his chest, forcing him to take it. I told him to open it and read the concrete medical facts for himself. Marcus slowly raised his trembling hands and took the envelope. He fumbled with the paper seal, his fingers clumsy and numb. He ripped the top of the envelope open and pulled out a thick stack of medical records and a printed transcript from my private investigator. Chloe saw the medical records in his hand and let out a blood-curdling scream of absolute terror. She abandoned her unconscious mother on the grass and sprinted across the stone patio toward Marcus. She tried to snatch the papers out of his hands, screaming that they were fake and that I was trying to poison his mind. Marcus did not let her take the papers. For the first time all day, he showed a flash of genuine anger and raw physical strength. He shoved Chloe away from him so forcefully that she stumbled backward and nearly fell onto the hard stone patio. He yelled at her to get away from him and not to touch him. His voice was a loud, booming roar that completely silenced the remaining guests. Chloe stood frozen, her face pale and streaked with ruined makeup, terrified by the sudden violent shift in her husband's demeanor. Marcus turned his back to her and held the medical documents up to the fading evening light. He began to read the pages one by one. I watched his eyes scan the detailed medical reports signed by her actual gynecologist. The reports explicitly confirmed that Chloe was perfectly healthy, but absolutely not pregnant. The doctor had noted her regular monthly visits and her continued use of preventative contraceptives. There was no record of an unborn child. There was no record of a positive blood test. There was absolutely nothing but a series of routine medical visits that completely contradicted every single lie she had told him over the past few weeks. Marcus read the medical reports, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. He looked like a man who was suffocating in the middle of a wide-open garden. Then he reached the second half of the documents. It was the printed transcript of the audio recording my private investigator had captured at the luxury coffee shop. Marcus read the exact words his wife had spoken to her best friend over expensive iced lattes. He read her cruel, calculating explanation of how she had printed a fake ultrasound picture off a random internet website. He read how she had presented that stolen image to him while he was completely exhausted from a massive surgical shift, manipulating his vulnerable emotional state. He read her disgusting plan to stage a fake tragic miscarriage to secure his permanent compliance and blind loyalty after the property was illegally transferred. Every single word on that printed transcript was a jagged knife stabbing directly into his heart. He realized that his profound joy and his deep anticipation of becoming a father were nothing but tools used by a ruthless predator to steal a mansion. He realized the tears of happiness he had cried when she showed him that fake ultrasound picture were entirely mocked and laughed at by his own wife. The profound betrayal completely shattered his entire world into a million jagged pieces. The illusion of his perfect, loving marriage evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a cold, dark, terrifying reality. He was completely alone, married to a monster who saw him only as a walking bank account. Marcus slowly lowered the stack of papers. He did not yell. He did not scream. The explosive anger he had shown just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, devastating emptiness. He turned around very slowly to face Chloe. She was standing a few feet away, trembling violently, her arms wrapped tightly around her own stomach, as if she was still trying to protect the fake baby. She looked at his dead, empty eyes, and she knew the absolute final end had arrived. She opened her mouth and tried to formulate one last desperate lie. She whispered his name and took a tiny, hesitant step forward, reaching her hand out toward him. Marcus looked at her outstretched hand, and then he looked at her face. The expression on his face was one of absolute, pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the kind of disgust a person reserves for a rotting corpse or a venomous snake. He did not see a beautiful blonde heiress anymore. He saw a pathetic lying thief who had tried to destroy his mother and completely manufacture a human life for financial gain. He let go of the thick stack of medical records and the private investigator transcripts. The white pages fluttered through the quiet evening air, scattering across the stone patio and landing softly on the green grass right at her expensive designer shoes. The papers laid there on the ground, exposing her absolute darkest secrets to the world. Marcus did not say a single word to her. He did not demand an explanation or an apology because he knew her words were entirely worthless. He simply turned his back on her completely, severing the emotional bond that had tied them together for the past 2 years. He walked away from her and walked directly toward me. He stopped in front of me and looked down at the ground, entirely ashamed of his previous actions. He had defended a criminal, and he had asked me to leave my own home, all for a woman who despised our family. The garden was perfectly quiet now, except for the soft sound of the evening breeze rustling through the leaves. Chloe was completely destroyed, standing alone among the scattered pages of her ruined life. Her father was bankrupt, her mother was unconscious, and her husband had just looked at her with pure, absolute hatred. The fake heir was exposed, and the entire Kensington plot was permanently dismantled. I stood tall and calm, watching the final pieces of my retaliation fall perfectly into place. I had protected my son and my empire, and I had shown the entire world exactly what happens when you try to steal from the Sterling family. Chloe fell to her knees completely broken, while Marcus stood quietly beside me, accepting the harsh reality of his completely shattered existence. The evening shadows consumed the garden completely, masking the expensive decorations, and leaving only the cold, hard truth exposed for everyone to see. Chloe was kneeling on the hard stone patio, surrounded by the scattered medical records that had completely destroyed her fake reality. She looked up at Marcus and realized that remaining silent was not going to save her. She had to try one last desperate maneuver to keep her grip on his mind. She pushed herself up from the ground, her white designer dress now stained with dirt and spilled champagne. She stumbled forward and threw her arms around Marcus, clinging to his tailored suit jacket, like a drowning woman holding onto a life raft. She buried her face in his chest and began to sob loudly. But these were not tears of genuine remorse. They were the highly calculated tears of a cornered predator. She looked up at him, her mascara running down her pale cheeks, and she started to actively twist the truth. She told Marcus that she only lied because she was absolutely terrified of losing him. She said she knew how badly he wanted a baby, and she felt so much immense pressure to be the perfect wife that she simply panicked. Then she pointed a shaking finger directly at me. She yelled that I was the one who drove her to do this. She claimed I was constantly stressing her out, making her feel inadequate and unwelcome in the family. She said my coldness and my impossible standards had forced her into a corner where she had to invent a pregnancy just to feel safe in her own marriage. She begged Marcus to understand that she forged the property deed because she wanted to build a secure nest for their future children, completely away from my toxic influence. She was actually trying to convince a brilliant trauma surgeon that committing medical fraud and real estate theft were acts of deep, romantic love. Marcus stood perfectly rigid while she clung to him. He did not wrap his arms around her. He did not stroke her blonde hair to comfort her. He just looked down at her with an expression of cold, terrifying clarity. For 2 entire years, he had been completely blinded by her beauty and her manipulated vulnerability. But the blindfold was permanently gone now. He reached down and grabbed her wrists, prying her hands off his suit jacket with undeniable physical force. He pushed her back, creating a wide physical space between them. Chloe stumbled and looked at him in total shock. Marcus shook his head slowly. His voice was low, but it vibrated with a deep, suppressed fury that I had never heard from him before. He told her to stop talking immediately. He told her every single word coming out of her mouth was absolute poison. He said he had spent his entire medical career dealing with real emergencies and real human tragedies. He told her he had held the hands of grieving mothers who had actually lost their babies in his hospital. He said the fact that she was willing to manufacture a fake pregnancy and meticulously plan a fake miscarriage just to steal a mansion was the most repulsive thing he had ever witnessed in his entire life. Chloe opened her mouth to argue, but Marcus cut her off completely. He raised his hand, silencing her. He told her she did not do this out of love or pressure. He told her she did it because she was an empty, greedy sociopath who only cared about money and social status. Marcus looked at his wife, and his eyes were entirely dead. He told her that their marriage was completely over. Chloe gasped loudly, bringing her hands to her mouth. Marcus did not flinch. He told her he was not just going to file for a standard divorce. He said he was going to contact his attorneys first thing in the morning and file for a complete legal annulment based entirely on massive premeditated fraud. He told her he was going to present the fake property deed, the fake medical records, and the private investigator transcripts directly to a family court judge. He promised her that when the judge saw the absolute depths of her deception, she would walk away from the marriage with absolutely nothing. No alimony, no financial settlement, no house. He told her she was going to return to her bankrupt parents and live the exact life she had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to escape. Chloe completely lost her mind. She started screaming and pulling at her own hair, throwing a massive childish temper tantrum right there on the stone patio. She yelled that he could not abandon her. She screamed that she had given him the best years of her life and that she deserved a massive financial payout for putting up with his demanding hospital schedule. Her true colors were shining so brightly they were blinding. She was no longer a weeping victim. She was a furious, screaming gold digger who realized the massive bank vault door had just been slammed permanently shut in her face. Marcus turned his back on her, completely ignoring her screaming fit. He looked physically exhausted, like a man who had just run a marathon through a burning forest. He walked slowly across the patio, leaving Chloe behind him. He walked directly toward me. I was standing tall and composed, my hands resting quietly at my sides. Marcus stopped right in front of me. His broad shoulders slumped forward, and the angry fire in his eyes was replaced by a deep, pathetic sadness. He looked like the little boy who used to run to me whenever he scraped his knee on the driveway. He reached his hands out toward me, expecting me to wrap my arms around him. He expected me to pull him into a warm, maternal hug and tell him that everything was going to be perfectly fine. He expected me to assure him that I would fix this massive mess and restore his luxurious lifestyle. He took a step closer, his eyes begging for unconditional comfort and absolution. He whispered my name softly, asking his mother to help him. He thought that because he had finally rejected Chloe, all his previous transgressions against me were instantly forgiven and forgotten. He thought the golden child was still fully entitled to his mother's limitless grace. I looked at my son. I looked at the boy I had sacrificed everything to protect. I felt a sharp, painful ache in my chest, but I absolutely refused to let it show on my face. I did not raise my arms to hug him. I did not offer him a warm, reassuring smile. Instead, I took a very slow, very deliberate step backward. I put a physical distance between us that mirrored the massive emotional distance he had created this morning. Marcus froze, his outstretched hands hanging awkwardly in the empty space between us. A look of profound confusion washed over his face. I looked him directly in the eyes, and my voice was completely devoid of any maternal warmth. I told him he did not get to play the victim right now. I told him he was not a helpless bystander who had simply been tricked by a bad woman. I reminded him of exactly what he did at 7 o'clock this morning. I told him that when Chloe handed me that fake eviction notice and told me to go back to the projects, he did not stand up for me. He hid in the bedroom like a coward. I told him that when we spoke in the private study earlier this afternoon, he looked me directly in the eye and told me to pack my bags. I repeated his exact words back to him. I reminded him that he told me to downsize. He told me I was being selfish. He told me I needed to respect his new family and leave my own home. I told Marcus that he chose her over me. He chose the illusion of a perfect, wealthy life with her over the mother who literally built the ground he was standing on. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting every single word strike him like a physical blow. I told him he was just as complicit as she was. I explained that Chloe might have been the one to forge the signature and scheme the theft, but he was the one who eagerly opened the front door and let the thief inside. He was the one who handed her the medical power of attorney because he was too lazy and too arrogant to handle his own financial affairs. I told him he allowed a woman who despised our family to disrespect me in my own house because he was too weak to set a firm boundary. I told him that actions have massive permanent consequences. I said the Sterling Family Trust does not reward weakness, and it absolutely does not reward disloyalty. I told him that just because he was finally filing for an annulment did not mean he was getting his trust fund back. I told him he was a grown man with a medical degree and a hospital salary. I said it was time for him to learn how to survive in the real world without his mother's money constantly shielding him from his own terrible decisions. Marcus stood completely paralyzed. Tears finally welled up in his dark eyes and spilled over his eyelashes, running silently down his face. He realized the absolute magnitude of what he had lost. He had not just lost his fake marriage and his stolen house. He had lost the unconditional support of the only person in the world who truly loved him. I turned my back on my weeping son. I walked away from him, heading toward the open French doors, leaving both the crying husband and the screaming wife standing alone in the ruins of the life they had completely destroyed together. The emotional devastation on the patio was suddenly interrupted by the heavy sound of tires crunching forcefully on the gravel driveway. I turned my attention away from my weeping son and looked toward the front gates. 3 massive black sport utility vehicles pulled aggressively onto the property, completely ignoring the frightened valet standing near the entrance. They parked in a sharp diagonal line, blocking the exit and sealing the estate entirely. The heavy doors of the lead vehicle opened, and my lead corporate attorney, Jonathan, stepped out into the evening light. He was flanked by 3 other sharply dressed lawyers from my firm, carrying thick leather briefcases filled with undeniable evidence. But they were not alone. From the other 2 vehicles stepped 4 individuals wearing plain clothes but displaying shiny silver badges clipped to their belts. These were not the local patrol officers who had visited the house earlier this afternoon. These were seasoned detectives from the white-collar corporate fraud division of the Atlanta Police Department. I had explicitly instructed Jonathan to have them on standby, and they had arrived at the exact, perfect moment to deliver the final lethal blow to the Kensington family. Jonathan led the imposing group of detectives straight through the front doors of my home and marched directly through the formal living room toward the back patio. The heavy synchronized footsteps of the lawyers and the detectives echoed loudly over the manicured lawn. The few wealthy guests who had not already fled the property froze in place, watching the serious group approach. Chloe was still kneeling on the stone patio, sobbing hysterically over the ruins of her fake marriage. When she heard the approaching footsteps, she slowly lifted her head. The thick black mascara she had carefully applied earlier in the day was now running in dark, ugly streaks down her pale cheeks, making her look like a completely deranged painting. She saw the detectives walking toward her, and her eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. She knew exactly why they were here. She scrambled backward on the hard stone, desperately trying to crawl away, but there was nowhere left to hide. Her father, Richard, was still leaning against the dining table, completely paralyzed by his own financial ruin, unable to step forward and protect his daughter. The lead detective, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, walked directly up to Chloe and looked down at her. He stated his name and department in a loud, clear voice that carried across the entire garden. He asked her to confirm her identity. Chloe could not even speak. She simply nodded her head, her entire body shaking violently in the cool evening breeze. The detective pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He told her he had a warrant for her immediate arrest. He read the charges aloud for everyone to hear. He stated she was being charged with felony forgery of official real estate documents and attempted grand larceny of a property valued at $2.5 million. He explained that these were severe corporate-level felonies carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of several years in a federal penitentiary. The wealthy guests, who were still lingering on the grass, gasped in collective horror. They were witnessing a high-society nightmare unfolding right in front of their eyes. Chloe let out a blood-curdling shriek that pierced the quiet evening air. She scrambled to her feet and tried to run toward Marcus, but the detectives were much faster. 2 officers grabbed her arms firmly, pinning them behind her back. Chloe fought them like a wild, trapped animal. She kicked her expensive designer shoes at their shins and twisted her body violently, trying to break free. She screamed absolute obscenities, cursing the officers, cursing Marcus, and cursing me with every vile word she could summon. The elegant, polite heiress facade was completely gone, replaced by a vulgar, desperate criminal throwing a massive, violent tantrum. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around her wrists echoed loudly across the patio. The sound was incredibly satisfying. It was the sound of absolute justice finally catching up to a woman who thought she was entirely above the law. The detectives read her rights while she continued to thrash and spit venom at anyone who looked in her direction. The detectives began walking her toward the front of the house, dragging her across her own lavish party. They led her past the formal dining tables, past the crystal champagne flutes, and past the shocked faces of her elite social circle. Chloe sobbed and screamed, her face completely twisted in pure rage and absolute humiliation. She looked at her wealthy friends, begging them to help her, but they all took a physical step back, turning their faces away in complete disgust. No one wanted to be associated with a screaming felon being dragged out of a stolen mansion. Susan Kensington had finally regained consciousness on the grass, only to wake up and see her daughter being hauled away in steel handcuffs. Susan began wailing uncontrollably, clinging to Richard, who simply stared straight ahead, completely broken and entirely defeated. Marcus stood beside me perfectly still, watching his wife being paraded through the garden like a common criminal. He did not say a single word. He did not try to stop the detectives. He simply watched the woman he thought he loved face the catastrophic consequences of her own terrible actions. The sight of the police dragging the screaming hostess through the house was the final breaking point for the country club guests. A wave of sheer panic washed over the remaining crowd. They realized they were standing in the middle of a massive federal crime scene involving corporate fraud and stolen property. They did not want their names recorded in any police reports, and they certainly did not want their flawless reputations tarnished by this catastrophic scandal. The wealthy men and women grabbed their expensive purses and tailored suit jackets and literally sprinted toward the front gates. They pushed past each other in a frantic, desperate stampede to reach their luxury vehicles. The young valet stood helplessly by as the elite guests shoved their way into their cars and sped out of the driveway, tires screeching loudly on the pavement. The beautiful, elegant housewarming party dissolved into a chaotic, terrifying evacuation. Within minutes, the entire manicured lawn was completely empty, save for the abandoned folding chairs and the discarded bidding paddles from the fake art auction. While the panicked guests fled the property, the head caterer walked out onto the patio. He had watched the entire arrest unfold from the kitchen, and he looked incredibly angry. He marched straight over to where I was standing, holding his black leather billing folder tightly in his hands. He told me that the hostess had just been hauled off to jail, and her credit card had been repeatedly declined all afternoon. He pointed an angry finger toward the massive tables overflowing with expensive caviar, imported truffles, and vintage champagne. He said his catering company was owed over $15,000 for the evening spread, and he demanded to know who was going to pay the massive invoice. I looked at the frustrated man and offered him a polite, understanding smile. I told him I completely understood his frustration, but I was absolutely not going to pay a single penny for a party I did not authorize. I explained that the woman who hired him was a fraud who had illegally trespassed on my corporate property. I told him his financial dispute was strictly with Chloe and her bankrupt family. The caterer let out a heavy sigh, realizing he had just been completely scammed by the Kensington family. He turned around and blew a sharp whistle, signaling his extensive staff. He ordered them to immediately start packing up every single piece of food and equipment. The kitchen staff rushed out onto the lawn, grabbing the silver trays, dumping the expensive food into large plastic garbage bags, and furiously disassembling the buffet stations. They were not gentle. They tossed the delicate crystal glasses into heavy plastic crates and ripped the expensive white linens right off the wooden tables. I stood on my stone patio and watched the aggressive, rapid dismantling of the fake kingdom Chloe had tried to build. The beautiful, elegant facade was being literally torn apart, piece by piece, leaving absolutely nothing behind but bare wooden tables and crushed grass. The string quartet had packed their instruments and fled long ago. The magnificent country club party was completely and permanently dead. I took a deep breath of the cool night air, letting the absolute peace of the moment wash over me. The heavy, suffocating presence of Chloe and her toxic lies had finally been removed from my property. The police cruisers at the front of the house turned on their bright flashing sirens, signaling their departure. They were taking my wicked daughter-in-law downtown to sit in a cold, concrete holding cell where she belonged. Richard and Susan were sitting alone on the dark grass, completely ignored by everyone mourning the absolute death of their social and financial existence. Jonathan, my lead attorney, walked up beside me and quietly handed me a sleek black pen and a new stack of corporate documents to finalize the foreclosure on the Kensington estate. I took the pen, feeling the cool metal in my fingers. The legal hammer had fallen with absolute devastating precision. I had successfully defended my home, my son, and my corporate empire from absolute ruin. The total humiliation of the Kensington family was now entirely complete, and I remained the undisputed owner of my own destiny. The flashing red and blue police lights faded into the dark Atlanta night, taking my treacherous daughter-in-law away to a cold concrete cell. I stood on the patio, listening to the complete silence that had returned to my property. The caterers were entirely gone, taking their untouched food and expensive white linens. The manicured lawn was empty save for tire tracks left by fleeing country club guests. I turned around and walked back through the open French doors, stepping into the warm light of my formal living room. The massive smart television was still glowing, displaying the undeniable financial ruin of the Kensington family. I picked up the small silver remote control and turned the screen off, plunging the room back into its normal, elegant ambiance. The grand housewarming party was over, but the final cleansing of my home had just begun. I walked out of the living room and stepped into the grand foyer. The sound of heavy plastic wheels scraping against my hardwood floors echoed down the hallway. I stood at the bottom of the sweeping staircase and watched a pathetic scene unfold. Richard and Susan Kensington were struggling to drag massive luxury suitcases down the carpeted steps. They had packed their bags, expecting to move into my guest wing permanently. Now they were being violently evicted from a house they never owned. Susan was still pale and visibly shaking from her fainting spell on the lawn. She clumsily pulled a heavy leather trunk, her high heels catching on the stairs. Richard was sweating profusely, his face a mask of absolute defeat and bitter humiliation. He grunted with exertion, wrestling suitcases down the steps completely stripped of his arrogant billionaire facade. There was no valet to carry their bags. There were no catering staff members to order around. There was only the harsh reality of their own physical labor and impending financial doom. I stood perfectly still, offering them absolutely no assistance. I watched them sweat and struggle under the heavy weight of their own massive greed. When they reached the marble floor of the foyer, they were breathing heavily. Susan refused to look in my direction, entirely consumed by her own public disgrace. Richard glared at me, but his fiery, aggressive hatred had been entirely extinguished. He looked like a hollow, broken shell of a man. He grabbed the handles of the suitcases and dragged them roughly across the marble. I followed them as they walked out the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped into the cool night air. The circular gravel driveway was completely empty except for their luxury sedan and the sleek vehicles belonging to my corporate legal team. Richard popped his trunk and began desperately throwing the heavy bags inside. He simply wanted to escape the scene of his ultimate humiliation. Susan opened the passenger door and collapsed into the leather seat, burying her face in her hands. I walked slowly down the marble front steps and approached the rear of their vehicle. My lead corporate attorney, Jonathan, was standing quietly nearby. He stepped forward and handed me a thick white legal envelope sealed with the official crest of my corporate firm. I took the envelope and walked directly up to Richard just as he slammed the trunk shut. He turned around and jumped slightly when he saw me standing so close to him. I held the thick envelope out toward him. I told him this was not a threat or a negotiation. I explained that inside this envelope was the formal legal notice of absolute foreclosure on his primary residence and immediate liquidation orders for his regional shipping company. I told him my legal team had already filed the paperwork with the city courts. I said he had exactly 48 hours to vacate his massive mansion before the county sheriffs arrived to physically remove his belongings and change the locks. Richard stared at the white envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely pinch the thick paper between his fingers. He took the envelope from me without saying a single word. There was absolutely nothing left for him to say. He knew he had completely lost the war. He opened the driver's side door and slid heavily behind the steering wheel. He started the engine and put the car into gear. He did not look back at me. He simply pressed his foot on the gas pedal and drove his luxury sedan slowly down the long gravel driveway. I stood on the front lawn and watched the red taillights disappear through the tall iron gates. They were driving back to a house they no longer owned, facing a massive mountain of debt they could never repay. The Kensington family had been completely officially and permanently eradicated from my life. I turned around and walked back inside my quiet home. I closed the heavy mahogany front doors, pushing the deadbolt firmly into place. The lower level of the house was completely secure. Now I had to face the most painful and difficult task of the entire evening. I walked up the grand staircase, my footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. I walked down the long upstairs hallway until I reached the entrance to the master suite. The heavy oak door was wide open. I stepped inside and found my son Marcus standing near the large walk-in closet. He had pulled a simple black canvas duffel bag from the top shelf and was slowly mechanically folding his clothes and placing them inside. He had taken off his expensive tailored suit jacket and unbuttoned the collar of his white dress shirt. He looked entirely exhausted, completely drained of all life and energy. He did not look up when I walked into the room. He knew I was standing there, but he was too deeply ashamed to meet my eyes. I walked further into the room and stopped near the foot of the massive king-sized bed. I watched him fold a pair of dark denim jeans and press them down into the canvas bag. I spoke his name quietly, breaking the heavy silence of the bedroom. He stopped moving, his hands resting on the edge of the bag. I told him that the events of today were the direct result of his complete inability to set boundaries and respect the sacrifices I had made for him. I explained that for 2 entire years I had watched him shower a manipulative parasite with my hard-earned money simply because he was desperate for her affection. I told him I had shielded him from financial struggle his entire life, wanting him to focus entirely on his medical career and saving lives. But I realized today that my financial protection had actually crippled his common sense. I told him he had grown incredibly arrogant and entirely entitled, assuming the family wealth would always be there to clean up his massive, catastrophic mistakes. Marcus slowly turned his head and looked at me. His dark eyes were red and swollen from crying silently. I kept my posture absolutely rigid, refusing to let my maternal instincts soften my resolve. I told him that as of this afternoon, he was officially and permanently removed as a beneficiary of the Sterling Family Trust. Marcus blinked, tears welling up in his eyes once again, but he did not argue. He simply nodded his head, accepting the harsh reality of his punishment. I told him he would no longer receive a single penny from the corporate accounts. I explained that the luxury credit cards, the expensive vehicles, and the fully funded lifestyle were entirely gone. I told him he was going to have to find a small, modest apartment in the city. He was going to have to sign a standard lease and pay his rent using the salary he earned from his grueling shifts at the hospital. He was going to have to learn the actual value of $1 the exact same way I had to learn it 30 years ago. I told him he needed to rebuild his life without my wealth. Marcus swallowed hard, wiping a tear from his cheek. He told me he understood and was deeply sorry. I simply nodded. Marcus zipped his duffel bag shut and hoisted it over his shoulder. We walked in complete silence down the staircase into the kitchen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his key ring. He slid the house keys off the ring and placed them onto the marble island. He softly whispered his final goodbye and walked out the front doors. I stood completely alone in the absolute peaceful silence of my beautiful and entirely pristine estate. The toxic elements that threatened my legacy were permanently eradicated forever. The final cleansing of my personal property was now fully officially and permanently complete. I had successfully protected my massive empire from absolutely all severe harm. 6 months have passed since the chaotic events of that Tuesday afternoon. The sweltering heat of the Atlanta summer has slowly faded into a crisp and beautiful autumn season. The leaves on the massive oak trees lining my long gravel driveway have turned brilliant shades of gold and deep crimson. My sprawling estate is perfectly quiet and completely serene once again. The heavy, suffocating energy that Chloe and her family brought into my sanctuary has been entirely washed away by the passage of time and the swift hand of justice. I am standing in my custom-built marble kitchen wearing my favorite emerald green silk robe, the exact same robe that was stolen from my closet 6 months ago. I am savoring my dark roast morning espresso and reflecting on exactly how drastically the world has changed for the people who foolishly tried to destroy my existence. Justice did not just arrive at my doorstep, it moved with absolute ruthless efficiency to correct the massive imbalance they attempted to create. Chloe is no longer wearing stolen vintage silk or drinking expensive vintage champagne on a manicured lawn. She is currently wearing a standard-issue beige canvas jumpsuit. The corporate fraud division of the police department built an absolute ironclad criminal case against her. They used the forged property deeds, her official statements to the police captain, and the incredibly damaging audio recordings provided by my private investigator. Her expensive high society defense attorneys immediately dropped her case the moment they realized her bankrupt parents could not pay their exorbitant legal retainer fees. Left completely undefended and facing overwhelming concrete evidence, she was forced to take a terrible plea deal to avoid a lengthy, agonizing public trial that would have exposed even more of her dark secrets. She is now facing exactly 3 years in a federal penitentiary for felony forgery and attempted grand larceny. I heard through my corporate legal team that she cried hysterically in the courtroom, falling to her knees and begging the judge for a suspended sentence. She claimed she was just a misunderstood young woman acting under immense emotional pressure. The judge was completely unmoved by her fake tears and manipulative performance. She will spend the next 36 months sitting in a small, cold concrete cell, reflecting on the exact moment she decided to hand me an eviction notice in my own beautiful kitchen. Her parents, Richard and Susan Kensington, suffered an equally devastating and highly public fate. My corporate legal team did not show them a single ounce of mercy or hesitation. We successfully foreclosed on their massive primary residence and fully liquidated every single physical asset tied to their failing regional shipping company within a matter of mere weeks. The commercial bank arrived with flatbed trucks and officially seized their luxury vehicles. Debt collectors took their expensive jewelry, and their prestigious country club memberships were permanently revoked due to unpaid dues and their new criminal associations. They were entirely excommunicated from their elite social circle. Not a single wealthy friend offered them a place to stay or a financial loan to help them survive. They are currently living in a dilapidated, run-down trailer park on the extreme dusty outskirts of the city. I was told by a mutual acquaintance that Susan spends her days sitting on a cheap plastic lawn chair, complaining bitterly to anyone who will listen about the lack of central air conditioning and the noise of her neighbors. Richard currently works part-time stocking heavy shelves at a local hardware store, trying desperately to scrape together enough money to buy simple groceries. They tried to steal a $2.5 million estate to secure their fake legacy, and instead, they lost absolutely everything they ever owned. As for my brilliant son Marcus, his life has also changed in unimaginable and deeply humbling ways. He followed through on his angry promise and filed for an immediate legal annulment based on massive premeditated emotional and financial fraud. But untangling a legal marriage from a convicted felon who is determined to drag out the process is a complicated and incredibly expensive endeavor. Because I permanently removed him from the Sterling family trust, he has absolutely no access to the massive wealth he grew up enjoying. He is currently living in a tiny, cramped studio apartment in a much less desirable industrial neighborhood downtown. He works grueling 80-hour shifts at the hospital, taking on extra exhausting surgical rotations, just to pay his aggressive divorce lawyers. He eats cheap takeout food sitting alone on a second-hand fabric sofa, and he sleeps in a small bed that takes up half of his entire living room. He has called my private number a few times and left long emotional voicemails apologizing for his profound blindness, his disrespect, and his absolute cowardice. I listen to his messages in the quiet of my study, but I do not call him back. I still love my son deeply, but he must walk through this intense purifying fire entirely alone. He must learn how to build his own strength, his own integrity, and his own character without his wealthy mother constantly clearing the path for him. It is an incredibly painful form of maternal tough love, but it is strictly necessary for his ultimate survival and growth as a responsible man. Today, however, is not a day for focusing on the heartbreaking tragedies of the past. Today is a day of absolute joyous celebration and deep gratitude. It is Sunday afternoon, and I am hosting a real elegant dinner party at my estate. I am not hosting fake high society people who care only about designer labels and massive bank account balances. I am hosting my true chosen family. The grand formal dining room is completely filled with strong, supportive, independent women who have stood by me for decades through every single trial and triumph. The mahogany table is surrounded by my loyal Charity Foundation board members and several former scholarship recipients. Captain Davis, the police officer who helped secure my home 6 months ago, is sitting at the table with his beautiful wife and his 2 bright young children, sharing stories and laughing loudly. The atmosphere is vibrant, warm, and overflowing with genuine, unconditional love. There are absolutely no fake smiles, and there are absolutely no hidden toxic agendas in this room. We are eating rich, authentic soul food prepared with immense care and history. There is a massive golden roasted turkey, baked macaroni and cheese, bubbling in cast iron pans, tender collard greens, and 3 different kinds of perfectly spiced sweet potato pie. The sound of real, deep belly laughter echoes off the high ceilings and fills every single corner of my massive home. I look around the dining table at the beautiful, radiant faces of the people who truly respect me and value my authentic presence. I realize that losing my biological son to his own foolish decisions created a vast open space in my life, a space that allowed me to fully embrace the wonderful people who truly honor my legacy and my spirit. I raise my crystal glass of sparkling apple cider and offer a genuine, heartfelt toast to truth, to unyielding resilience, and to the absolute power of standing your ground when the world tries to push you down. After dinner, I step away from the loud, joyful dining room for just a moment and walk into my quiet, formal living room. I stand perfectly still and look directly ahead, reflecting on the incredible, exhausting journey of the past 6 months. I realize a profound and undeniable truth that I deeply want to share with everyone listening to my story right now. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. I spent years building my massive corporate empire, hoping to give my son a much easier life than the difficult one I had to endure. But in doing so, I completely forgot to teach him the actual intrinsic value of that life. I gave him the entire world on a silver platter, and he handed it directly to a calculating thief. As for the little entitled girl who stood in my kitchen and boldly told me not to come home, she learned a devastating historical lesson the incredibly hard way. She learned that you never invite the queen out of her own castle. Have you ever had a toxic daughter-in-law or an entitled family member try to forcefully push you out of your own life? Tell me your personal stories down in the comments section below. I want to read exactly how you stood up for yourself and reclaimed your own power and dignity. Please subscribe to the channel for more true stories about overcoming family betrayal and securing your own personal justice. And remember, above all else, protect your peace, establish ironclad boundaries, and always lock your safes.